The October morning arrived cold and gray over Naval Station Pacific Harbor, the kind of morning where fog rolled off the ocean in thick waves that blurred the edges of reality. Lieutenant Commander Elena Reeves stepped out of the unmarked sedan at exactly 05:45 hours, her boots touching the wet asphalt with barely a sound. She wore the standard khaki uniform of a junior logistics officer, her ribbons modest, her rank insignia deliberately understated. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything more than another transfer filling a gap in the administrative staff. The driver, a young Seaman apprentice named Collins, unloaded her single duffel bag from the trunk. "Ma'am, would you like me to escort you to the administration building?" "That won't be necessary, Seaman," Elena replied, her voice quiet but carrying an edge of authority that made Collins stand a little straighter. "I can find my way." She shouldered the duffel, heavier than it looked, packed with more than just uniforms, and walked toward the main complex. The base was already coming alive with the organized chaos of morning muster. Sailors in their working uniforms moved with purpose between buildings, and the distant sound of boots striking concrete echoed across the parade ground. Elena had been to Pacific Harbor before, though none of the current personnel would know that. 7 years ago, she had spent 3 weeks here during a classified operation that officially never happened. The base had changed since then, new buildings, upgraded security, a different energy, but the bones remained the same. She noted the guard rotations, the pom replacements, the blind spots that no security assessment seemed to address. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Old habits died hard. Even now, operating under the cover of a simple logistics transfer, Elena's mind automatically cataloged tactical information. The SEAL training never truly left you, even when you wore a different uniform and answered to a different name. She passed through the main gate checkpoint, presenting her transfer orders to the petty officer on duty. He barely glanced at them, his eyes skimming over her junior rank insignia before waving her through. "Administration building is straight ahead, ma'am. You'll want to check in with Commander Jacobson in personnel." "Thank you," Elena said, allowing a slight Texas accent to color her words. It was a small detail, but details mattered when you were trying to blend in. The woman who had earned the call sign Wraith during 6 years in naval special warfare understood that invisibility was often the most effective armor. The administration building was a 3-story structure that had seen better decades. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed against cream-colored walls decorated with mandatory safety posters and photographs of former commanding officers. The smell was universal to military buildings everywhere: industrial cleaner, old coffee, and the faint mustiness of air conditioning systems that had been running since the Cold War. Elena found Commander Jacobson's office on the 2nd floor. The nameplate on the door was slightly crooked, a small imperfection that seemed at odds with military precision. She knocked twice and waited. "Enter," came a woman's voice from inside. Commander Sarah Jacobson was in her late 40s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that missed very little. She looked up from her computer screen as Elena entered, her expression neutral but assessing. Elena recognized the look immediately. Another woman who had fought her way up through ranks that weren't always welcoming, someone who had learned to evaluate threats and allies in the space of a heartbeat. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves reporting as ordered, ma'am," Elena said, standing at attention. Jacobson's eyes traveled over Elena's uniform, noting the logistics insignia, the modest ribbon rack that suggested a career spent behind desks rather than in combat zones. "At ease, Lieutenant Commander. Welcome to Pacific Harbor. Your orders say you're here to assist with the logistics audit for the upcoming fleet deployment." "Yes, ma'am. I understand the current inventory systems need comprehensive review before the Roosevelt Carrier Group deploys next month." Jacobson nodded slowly, but there was something in her expression, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps suspicion, that told Elena this woman wasn't entirely convinced by the cover story. The audit is important work, but I'll be honest with you, Reeves. We're not exactly excited about having someone from Naval Operations Command looking over our shoulders. It was a test, Elena realized. Jacobson was probing to see how she would react to resistance, whether she would pull rank or try to smooth things over. Elena chose her words carefully. I'm here to help, ma'am, not to create problems. My job is to make sure the fleet has what it needs when it needs it. If that means I need to step on some toes to make that happen, I will. But I'd prefer to work with people rather than against them. Something in Jacobson's expression softened fractionally. Fair enough. Your workspace is on the first floor, Office 112. You'll be sharing with Lieutenant Foster from Supply. He's competent enough, but he's also been at this post for 8 years and doesn't always appreciate new perspectives. I'll keep that in mind, ma'am. There's a senior staff briefing at 0900 in the main conference room, Jacobson continued, returning her attention to her computer screen. Admiral Hawthorne will be there, along with most of the senior officers. You're not required to attend as a junior logistics officer, but you might find it useful to understand how things operate around here. Elena recognized the subtle invitation for what it was, an opportunity to observe the base's leadership dynamics. I appreciate that, ma'am. I'll be there. As Elena left Jacobson's office, she caught the older woman studying her with an intensity that suggested her cover might not be as solid as naval intelligence had promised. But Jacobson said nothing, and Elena didn't give her any reason to dig deeper. Office 112 was exactly what Elena had expected. A cramped space with 2 desks, 4 filing cabinets, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. One desk was immaculately organized with color-coded files and a coffee mug that proclaimed, "Supply officers do it better." The other desk, presumably hers, was empty except for a dusty computer monitor and a broken stapler. Elena set her duffel beside the empty desk and took a moment to survey her new workspace. The walls were decorated with supply chain flowcharts and a calendar that was 3 months out of date. A small photograph tucked beside the organized desk showed a man in his early 30s with his arm around a woman and 2 young children. Lieutenant Foster, presumably with his family. She had 90 minutes before the senior staff briefing. Elena used the time to set up her workspace and access the base's inventory database. Her credentials had been carefully crafted to give her access to logistics systems while hiding her actual security clearance level. As far as anyone at Pacific Harbor knew, Lieutenant Commander Elena Reeves was a moderately talented logistics officer who had spent her entire career in supply chain management. The truth was considerably more complicated. Elena had joined the Navy 12 years ago with dreams of serving on a destroyer, maybe eventually commanding her own ship. But during officer candidate school, a SEAL recruiter had seen something in her, an intensity, a refusal to quit, a willingness to push past every limit that conventional wisdom said women couldn't cross. He had asked her 3 simple questions. Could she swim 5 miles in open ocean? Could she function on 2 hours of sleep for a week straight? Could she put the mission above everything else, including her own survival? Elena had answered yes to all 3 questions, though she hadn't fully understood what those answers would cost her. The next 6 years had been a blur of training, deployments, operations that existed only in classified files. She had earned her trident the hard way, becoming one of only a handful of women to complete the full SEAL qualification course. The call sign, Wraith, had come during her 3rd deployment, after a hostage rescue operation where she had moved through an enemy compound like smoke, unseen and unstoppable, extracting 3 American contractors from what everyone else had written off as a suicide mission. But SEAL teams operated in the shadows, and shadows didn't care about gender politics or glass ceilings. Elena had proven herself in combat, but the Navy's bureaucracy moved slowly when it came to integrating women into special warfare units. Her presence had caused friction, resentment, and eventually a decision by leadership to reassign her to less controversial duties. The official story was that Elena had requested a transfer to logistics due to chronic injuries sustained during training. The truth was that naval intelligence had approached her with an opportunity: use her unique skill set for a different kind of mission. There were questions about corruption in supply chains, equipment that disappeared before reaching combat units, contracts that seemed designed to enrich specific companies rather than support military readiness. Elena's new assignment was simple in concept but dangerous in execution: go undercover as a junior logistics officer and identify the source of the corruption. The mission would require her to be invisible, to blend in, to let people underestimate her while she gathered evidence. It was, in many ways, the hardest thing she had ever done. Harder than Hell Week, harder than combat operations, harder than earning her trident, because it required her to pretend to be less than she was, to accept disrespect and condescension, to watch people dismiss her based on her gender and her junior rank while she quietly documented their crimes. But Elena had never walked away from a mission in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The senior staff briefing room was larger than Elena had expected, with seating for approximately 200 personnel. When she arrived at 0850, the room was already half full with officers from every department on the base. The energy was formal but relaxed, people who worked together regularly, comfortable in their hierarchies and routines. Elena chose a seat near the back, positioning herself where she could observe without being conspicuous. She recognized the tactical advantage of the position immediately: clear sightlines to all entrances, close to an exit, elevated enough to see over most heads. Old habits. The officers around her paid her little attention. A junior lieutenant commander in logistics wasn't particularly interesting to the senior leadership that filled the front rows. Elena used the time to study faces, match names to positions, and identify the power dynamics that weren't printed on any organizational chart. Captain Michael Chambers entered the room at 0855, his presence immediately commanding attention. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades at sea. His uniform was immaculate, his ribbons impressive, his expression suggesting a man comfortable with authority. Behind him walked Commander Richard Torres, the base's executive officer, whose eyes constantly scanned the room as if cataloging every person present. But it was the third man who caught Elena's attention and sent a chill of recognition down her spine. Commander Marcus Garrett. Elena hadn't expected to see him here, though in retrospect she should have anticipated it. Garrett was Pacific Harbor's operations officer, responsible for coordinating training exercises and deployment readiness. He was also, according to Elena's classified briefing materials, the prime suspect in the equipment diversion scheme she had been sent to investigate. Garrett was 47 years old with a service record that was impressive on paper: 25 years, in the Navy, multiple deployments, commendations for administrative excellence. But there were gaps in his record, assignments that didn't quite make sense, periods where his efficiency reports were either glowing or conspicuously absent. Elena had spent weeks studying everything naval intelligence had compiled on Garrett. He was smart, careful, and protected by relationships built over decades of service. He was also allegedly responsible for diverting millions of dollars worth of equipment through creative accounting and falsified inventory reports. As Garrett moved to his seat in the front row, his eyes swept across the assembled officers. For just a moment, his gaze paused on Elena. She kept her expression neutral, mildly interested but not engaged. Just another junior officer attending her first senior staff briefing. Garrett's eyes moved on, dismissing her as irrelevant. Perfect. Admiral James Hawthorne entered at precisely 0900, and the room snapped to attention with practiced precision. Hawthorne was a legend in the Navy. 3 stars earned through a combination of tactical brilliance and political savvy, a man who had commanded carrier groups and shaped policy at the Pentagon. He was also, Elena knew from her briefing, completely unaware of the corruption happening under his command. "At ease," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Take your seats." The briefing began with standard updates, training schedules, maintenance reports, personnel movements. Elena listened carefully, noting not just what was said, but how it was said, who deferred to whom, who challenged statements, who remained silent when questions were raised. Commander Garrett spoke for 15 minutes about the upcoming deployment exercises, his presentation smooth and confident. He detailed equipment requirements, training objectives, and coordination with other naval assets. On the surface, everything sounded professional and well-organized, but Elena noticed small discrepancies. Equipment numbers that didn't quite match the inventory reports she had reviewed that morning. Training dates that seemed oddly compressed, leaving little time for the maintenance procedures that should have been scheduled. Small details that most people would miss, but that screamed of a system designed to hide rather than illuminate. As Garrett concluded his presentation, Admiral Hawthorne nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Marcus. It sounds like we're well prepared for the Roosevelt deployment." "Thank you, sir," Garrett replied, his satisfaction evident. That's when Captain Chambers spoke up, his voice cutting through the congratulatory atmosphere. "Commander Garrett, I have a question about the equipment inventories you just presented." The room's energy shifted subtly. Chambers had a reputation as a stickler for details, someone who didn't accept numbers at face value. Garrett's smile remained in place, but Elena saw his jaw tighten fractionally. "Of course, Captain. What specifically concerns you?" "Your presentation lists 67 portable communications units allocated for the training exercises," Chambers said, consulting his notes. "But the quarterly inventory report from last month showed only 52 units in serviceable condition. Did we receive additional units, or has the inventory been updated?" It was a good question, the kind of question that revealed someone was actually reading the reports rather than just accepting briefings at face value. Elena leaned forward slightly, curious to see how Garrett would respond. "The inventory has been updated, Captain," Garrett replied smoothly. "We received a priority shipment last week that brought our communications assets up to full strength." "I see. And that shipment would be documented in the receiving reports from supply, which should have been distributed earlier this week." Chambers made a note, his expression neutral. "I don't recall seeing those reports." "Commander Torres, did your office receive the updated inventory documentation?" Torres looked uncomfortable. "I'll need to check with my staff, sir. It's possible the reports are still being processed." It was a small moment, easily dismissed as routine administrative confusion, but Elena recognized it for what it was, evidence that Garrett's accounting didn't withstand scrutiny. The communications units he had claimed either didn't exist or had been diverted to other purposes, and the documentation he referenced was probably fiction. The briefing continued for another 45 minutes, covering topics ranging from base security to upcoming inspections. Elena took notes when appropriate, asked no questions, and maintained the perfect demeanor of a junior officer trying to learn the ropes. As the briefing concluded and officers began filing out, Elena found herself accidentally in Garrett's path near the exit. She stepped aside to let him pass, but he paused, studying her with an intensity that suggested he was reassessing his initial dismissal. "I don't believe we've met," Garrett said, his tone friendly but his eyes calculating. "Commander Marcus Garrett, Operations Officer." "Lieutenant Commander Elena Reeves, sir," Elena replied, offering her hand. "I just transferred in to help with the logistics audit." Garrett's handshake was firm but not crushing. The grip of someone who understood power was about control rather than dominance. "Ah, yes, the audit. Commander Jacobson mentioned we'd be getting someone from Nav Ops Command. How are you finding Pacific?" Harbor, so far? It's an impressive facility, sir. Everyone has been very welcoming. That's good to hear. Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. Logistics audits can be tedious work. Lots of inventory reports and supply chain documentation. Not exactly the glamorous side of military service. There was something in his tone that suggested he was probing, testing to see how she would react to the implicit dismissal of her role. Elena kept her expression pleasant and slightly self-deprecating. I don't mind the tedious work, sir. Someone has to make sure the numbers add up correctly. Indeed they do, Garrett replied, though his smile had taken on a harder edge. Well, if you need any assistance understanding how our operations systems work, feel free to reach out to my staff. We're always happy to help. Junior officers find their way. The pause before junior officers was deliberate, a subtle reminder of rank and hierarchy. Elena recognized the power play for what it was, Garrett establishing that he saw her as insignificant, someone who could be managed or intimidated if she became inconvenient. I appreciate that, sir, Elena said, maintaining her pleasant demeanor. As Garrett walked away, Elena noticed Commander Torres watching the interaction with an expression that suggested he had seen similar moments before. Torres approached her, his manner more casual than Garrett's had been. Don't take Garrett too seriously, Torres said quietly. He gets territorial about operations and logistics, thinks audits are implied criticism of his management. I understand, sir. I'm just here to do my job. Torres nodded, but there was something in his expression, a wariness, perhaps concern, that suggested he might suspect more than he was saying. Just be careful, Reeves. Politics around here can be complicated, and sometimes people who ask too many questions find their assignments suddenly become very unpleasant. It was as close to a warning as Torres could give without explicitly saying that something was wrong. Elena filed the information away, adding Torres to her mental list of personnel who might be allies if things got complicated. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Elena returned to Office 112 and began her actual work, reviewing inventory databases, cross-referencing equipment requisitions with receiving reports, and building a timeline of discrepancies. It was tedious work, exactly as Garrett had suggested, but Elena had learned long ago that the devil lived in details that most people ignored. She was deep in a comparison of communications equipment records when Lieutenant Foster finally arrived. He was younger than his photograph had suggested, perhaps 32, with the slightly harried expression of someone perpetually behind on paperwork. You must be Reeves, he said, dropping a stack of files on his desk. Sorry I wasn't here earlier. Had to deal with a crisis in the supply warehouse. Someone miscounted the inventory of replacement parts, and now nothing matches the computer records. Happens more often than it should, Elena said, neutrally. Foster laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Story of my life. Welcome to Pacific Harbor, where the inventory reports are made up and the numbers don't matter. It was said as a joke, but Elena heard the frustration underneath. Foster had been at this post for 8 years, dealing with systems that didn't work properly and superiors who didn't care as long as the paperwork looked correct. Is it always this disorganized? Elena asked carefully. Foster glanced at the closed office door, then lowered his voice. Between you and me, it's gotten worse in the last 3 years, ever since Commander Garrett took over operations coordination. Equipment gets requisitioned but never shows up. Reports get filed but the numbers never match. And when you try to ask questions, he shrugged. Let's just say that people who make waves around here tend to find themselves transferred to much less pleasant assignments. Sounds frustrating. It is. But I've got 2 kids and a mortgage, and this is a stable post. So I do my job, I file my reports, and I try not to think too hard about where all the missing equipment actually ends up. It was exactly the attitude that allowed corruption to flourish. good people who saw problems but felt powerless to address them. Elena understood Foster's position, but she also knew that silence made you complicit. "Well," Elena said, returning her attention to her computer screen, "maybe this audit will help clean things up." Foster made a sound that might have been laughter or despair. "Yeah, maybe, but don't hold your breath." Section 3. The First Hints. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena established her routine and built her cover identity. She arrived at Office 112 each morning at 0700, spent her days buried in inventory reports, and left at 1700 like clockwork. She ate lunch in the junior officers' mess, participated in mandatory fitness training, and attended the weekly logistics coordination meetings. To everyone at Pacific Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Elena Reeves was exactly what she appeared to be, a moderately competent logistics officer doing unglamorous audit work that nobody particularly cared about. But beneath that mundane surface, Elena was systematically building a case against Commander Garrett that would be impossible to dismiss. She had identified at least 17 instances where equipment had been requisitioned for training exercises, but never actually delivered to the units that supposedly received it. Communications gear, night vision devices, specialized tools, millions of dollars worth of material that existed on paper but had vanished into thin air. The pattern was sophisticated. Garrett would requisition equipment for legitimate training purposes, then falsify receiving reports to show the equipment had been delivered. The units conducting the training would use their existing gear, never realizing they were supposed to have received replacements. The requisitioned equipment would be diverted to shell companies that Garrett partly owned, then sold to foreign militaries at substantial profit. It was a brilliant scheme in its way, hidden in the noise of normal military logistics, protected by the complexity of supply chain management, and defended by Garrett's reputation and rank. Without someone specifically looking for the pattern, it would be almost impossible to detect. But Elena had been specifically looking, and she had found more than enough evidence to justify a full criminal investigation. The challenge was that gathering evidence wasn't the same as surviving long enough to present it. Elena knew from experience that cornered criminals were dangerous, and Garrett had too much invested in his scheme to let it collapse without a fight. She noticed the surveillance on her third day of serious investigation. Nothing obvious, just the same faces appearing too regularly in the junior officers' mess. A car that seemed to follow her route during her evening runs. Questions from colleagues that probed a little too specifically into her background. Garrett knew she was investigating him. The question was how much he knew and what he planned to do about it. Elena's answer came during the weekly logistics coordination meeting on Friday afternoon. The meeting was normally routine, department heads sharing updates about supply chains, maintenance schedules, and equipment readiness. But this week, Commander Garrett attended personally rather than sending one of his staff officers. "I wanted to address some concerns about the upcoming audit," Garrett said after the standard updates had been completed. His tone was reasonable, almost apologetic. "It's come to my attention that Lieutenant Commander Reeves has been asking very detailed questions about equipment requisitions and inventory reconciliation." Every eye in the room turned toward Elena. She kept her expression neutral, professional curiosity rather than concern. "That's her job, isn't it?" Commander Jacobson said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "The audit is supposed to be comprehensive." "Of course," Garrett agreed, "and I fully support thorough audits. But I'm concerned that someone without extensive operational experience might not understand the complexities of combat logistics. Training exercises require flexibility, and sometimes equipment gets deployed differently than initial requisitions suggest." It was a masterful piece of misdirection, suggesting that Elena's findings were the result of her inexperience rather than evidence of actual wrongdoing. Several officers nodded, accepting Garrett's framing without question. "Commander Garrett," Elena said quietly, I've reviewed the requisition protocols, and they're quite clear about documentation requirements. When equipment is reallocated during exercises, there should be field modification reports filed within 48 hours. I haven't been able to locate those reports for several recent training events. The room went silent. Elena had just directly challenged a senior officer in front of his peers, a breach of military etiquette that would normally be considered career suicide for a junior logistics officer. Garrett's expression didn't change, but Elena saw his jaw tighten. The reports exist, Lieutenant Commander. Perhaps you simply haven't been looking in the right places. I'd be happy to have your staff point me toward the correct databases, sir. I'll have someone from my office contact you, Garrett replied, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. But Commander Jacobson wasn't finished. Marcus, if there are documentation gaps, we need to address them before the Inspector General's visit next month. Can you commit to having your staff provide Lieutenant Commander Reeves with the complete reports by Monday? Garrett had been outmaneuvered. Refusing would make him look like he was hiding something, but complying would force him to produce documentation that Elena strongly suspected didn't exist. Of course, Garrett said after a long pause. I'll make sure my staff prioritizes the request. As the meeting concluded, Elena felt rather than saw Garrett watching her. She had pushed him into a corner, and cornered animals were unpredictable. She needed to be careful about how she proceeded. That evening, as Elena was leaving the administration building, she found Commander Torres waiting by her car. His presence wasn't threatening, but it was deliberate. "Walk with me for a minute?" Torres asked, not quite making it a question. They walked in silence toward the waterfront, where the Pacific Ocean stretched dark and restless under the evening sky. Torres didn't speak until they were far enough from other personnel to ensure privacy. "You're pushing Garrett pretty hard," Torres said finally. "That's either brave or foolish, and I'm not sure which. I'm just doing my job, sir. Your job doesn't usually involve publicly challenging an operations officer about missing documentation. That's the kind of thing that ends careers." Torres paused, studying her face in the dim light. "Unless you're not just a logistics officer doing an audit." Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't know what you mean, sir. I've been in the Navy for 23 years, Reeves. I've seen my share of cover assignments. You're good, better than most. But there are little things. The way you carry yourself, the way your eyes track every entrance and exit, the fact that you spotted the surveillance on day 3, when most officers wouldn't have noticed it at all." Elena said nothing, waiting to see how much Torres actually knew. "I'm not going to ask what you really are or who sent you," Torres continued, "but I am going to tell you that Garrett is dangerous. He's got friends in high places. He's got resources you probably don't know about, and he's got a lot to lose if someone exposes what he's been doing." "What has he been doing, sir?" Torres laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not stupid enough to say it out loud where it could be recorded, but I've been watching the inventory discrepancies for 2 years, and I've been documenting everything I could safely document. If you're really here to take him down, you should know that you're not the first person to try." "What happened to the others?" "Lieutenant Shaw requested a transfer after her car had an unfortunate brake failure. Commander Peterson developed a sudden alcohol problem that required medical treatment. Captain Brennan was reassigned to Alaska after classified documents mysteriously appeared in his quarters." Torres looked directly at Elena. "Garrett protects himself, and he doesn't care who gets hurt in the process. Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone needs to stop him. The Navy I joined didn't tolerate corruption, and watching it happen makes me sick. But I've got 6 months until retirement, and I'm not going to throw away 23 years for a fight I can't win." Torres handed Elena a small USB drive. "There's nothing on here that directly implicates Garrett. I'm not that brave. But it's got 3 years of inventory discrepancies organized by category. Maybe it'll help you build your case." Elena took the drive, understanding that Torres was offering what support he could while protecting himself. It wasn't heroic, but it was honest. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me, just be careful and watch your back, especially around Commander Garrett." As Torres walked away, Elena pocketed the USB drive and looked out at the dark ocean. She had known this assignment would be dangerous, but the conversation with Torres had clarified just how serious the threat was. Garrett wasn't just corrupt, he was actively eliminating anyone who threatened his operation, which meant Elena needed to move faster than she had originally planned. The evidence she had gathered was solid, but it wasn't yet complete enough to guarantee a successful prosecution. She needed one more piece, something that directly connected Garrett to the diverted equipment and the shell companies receiving it. And she had a good idea where to find it. The Monday morning briefing started exactly like every other senior staff meeting Elena had attended over the past 3 weeks. 175 officers filled the conference room, representing every department and command on the base. The atmosphere was routine, almost mundane, officers reviewing notes, sipping coffee, engaging in quiet conversations about weekend activities and upcoming assignments. Elena sat in her usual position near the back, her tablet open to what appeared to be logistics spreadsheets, but was actually the encrypted evidence file she had been building against Commander Garrett. The USB drive Torres had given her contained exactly what she had hoped for: 3 years of meticulously documented inventory discrepancies that correlated perfectly with her own findings. She now had enough evidence to justify criminal charges. The question was how to deliver that evidence to the proper authorities without Garrett interfering. Admiral Hawthorne called the meeting to order at 0900 sharp. The agenda was standard: operational updates, training schedules, personnel movements, and budget discussions. Elena listened with half her attention while the other half worked through the tactical problem of how to survive the next 48 hours. Garrett knew she was closing in on him. The surveillance had intensified over the weekend. Her quarters had been searched while she was at the gym. Her computer login attempts were being monitored, and twice she had spotted the same enlisted personnel following her during her evening runs. Garrett was preparing to make a move, and Elena needed to be ready when he did. The briefing proceeded through its standard sections. Captain Chambers reported on maintenance status. Commander Torres discussed personnel readiness. Lieutenant Commander Morrison provided updates on security protocols. Everything was calm, professional, and entirely ordinary. Then Garrett stood to deliver his operations update, and Elena felt the atmosphere in the room shift subtly. "Good morning," Garrett began, his voice carrying its usual confidence. "I have some concerning developments to report regarding the logistics audit that Lieutenant Commander Reeves has been conducting." Every head in the room turned toward Elena. She kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. This was the move she had been anticipating. Garrett was going on offense, trying to discredit her before she could present her evidence. "Over the past 3 weeks," Garrett continued, "Lieutenant Commander Reeves has been making serious allegations about missing equipment and falsified documentation. These allegations, if true, would suggest systemic corruption in our supply chain management." Admiral Hawthorne leaned forward, his expression grave. "Commander Garrett, are you saying there's evidence of criminal activity?" "I'm saying there are significant discrepancies in the audit findings, sir. Lieutenant Commander Reeves has identified what she believes are missing equipment and falsified reports. However, when my staff investigated her claims, we found multiple errors in her analysis. It was a masterful setup." Garrett was acknowledging the discrepancies Elena had found while simultaneously suggesting she had made mistakes. The implication was clear. The problem wasn't corruption, but rather an inexperienced auditor who didn't understand the complexity of military logistics. Elena's hand tightened around her stylus, but she remained silent. Interrupting now would make her look defensive and unprofessional. "Specifically," Garrett said, pulling up a presentation on the main screen, "Lieutenant Commander Reeves flagged 67 communications units as missing from our inventory. However, those units were actually deployed with the training squadron to San Diego 3 weeks ago. The documentation exists. She simply didn't look in the correct database. The officers around Elena shifted uncomfortably. If Garrett's claim was true, it would undermine everything she had reported. But Elena knew it wasn't true. She had checked every database, including the deployment tracking system. The communications units Garrett claimed were in San Diego didn't exist. "Commander Garrett," Elena said quietly, standing up. The breach of protocol, a junior officer interrupting a senior officer's briefing, caused heads to turn throughout the room. "I did check the deployment tracking database. Those communications units aren't listed as deployed to San Diego or anywhere else." Garrett's smile was patient, almost condescending. "Lieutenant Commander, I appreciate your thoroughness, but perhaps you're not familiar with our deployment tracking protocols. Equipment deployed for classified exercises isn't always listed in the standard databases. Then those deployments would be documented in the classified operations log," Elena replied, her voice calm but firm. "I have top secret clearance. I checked that database as well. The communications units aren't there either." The room went completely silent. Elena had just revealed that she had security clearance well above what a junior logistics officer should possess. It was a calculated risk, breaking her cover to prevent Garrett from successfully discrediting her evidence. Admiral Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves, why does a logistics officer have top secret clearance?" Before Elena could answer, Garrett spoke, his voice carrying a note of triumph. "That's an excellent question, Admiral. In fact, I've been curious about Lieutenant Commander Reeves's background since she arrived. Her service record seems incomplete. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one." Elena knew what was coming. Garrett had been digging into her cover identity, and he had obviously found discrepancies. The question was how much he had discovered and how he planned to use that information. "According to the personnel records," Garrett continued, "Lieutenant Commander Reeves spent her entire career in supply chain management. But when I contacted some of her previous commanding officers to verify her qualifications for this audit, I received some interesting responses." Garrett pulled up what appeared to be an official email on the screen. "Commander Peterson at Naval Supply Center, Norfolk, had no recollection of Lieutenant Commander Reeves serving under his command, despite her service record indicating she spent 2 years at that posting." A murmur rippled through the room. If Garrett's claim was accurate, it suggested Elena's service record was falsified, which would be grounds for immediate removal from the base and possibly criminal charges. But Elena knew the truth. Commander Peterson was one of the officers Garrett had forced out after he started investigating the corruption. The email Garrett was displaying was either fabricated or coerced. "Admiral," Elena said, her voice cutting through the rising chatter, "I request permission to address these allegations directly." Hawthorne studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Proceed, Lieutenant Commander." Elena took a breath, making a decision that would either save the investigation or destroy it completely. "Sir, my service record is intentionally incomplete because I've been operating undercover for Naval Criminal Investigative Service. My actual rank is Commander, and I'm a former SEAL team leader. I was sent here 3 months ago to investigate systematic equipment diversion and corruption in the supply chain." The conference room exploded in shocked conversation. Officers turned to each other in disbelief, some looking at Elena with newfound respect, others with suspicion. Admiral Hawthorne raised his hand for silence, his face pale. "Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said, emphasizing her actual rank, "do you have documentation to support this claim?" "Yes, sir. I have a sealed authorization letter from the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations in my quarters. along with encrypted evidence files documenting 3 years of equipment diversion totaling approximately $18 million in military assets. Garrett's face had gone white, then red. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "She's making this up to cover her mistakes. If she was really NCIS, where's her badge? Where's her authorization?" "The authorization letter is in my quarters, as I just stated," Elena replied calmly. "It was sealed and only to be opened in case of emergency or compromise of the investigation. I believe we've reached that point." Admiral Hawthorne looked between Elena and Garrett, clearly trying to assess which of them was telling the truth. "Commander Torres, escort Commander Reeves to her quarters and retrieve this documentation. Commander Garrett, you will remain here." Torres stood immediately, his expression carefully neutral, but Elena saw relief in his eyes. He had been waiting for someone to make a move against Garrett, and now it was finally happening. As Elena and Torres headed toward the exit, Garrett's voice stopped them. "Admiral, with all due respect, I think we need to consider the possibility that Commander Reeves, if that's even her real name, might be attempting to cover up her own incompetence with wild accusations." Elena turned back, meeting Garrett's eyes. "Commander Garrett, I have documented evidence of 17 separate instances where you requisitioned equipment for training, exercises that never reached their intended units. I have traced those diversions to 3 shell companies that you partly own, and I have bank records showing deposits to your personal accounts that correspond exactly with the timing of those equipment transfers." The room went dead silent. Elena had just made public accusations that, if false, would end her career and potentially result in criminal charges. If true, they would end Garrett's career and send him to prison. Garrett's composure finally cracked. His face flushed with rage, and he took 3 quick steps toward Elena. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You come into my base, my command, and you have the audacity." "Your base." Admiral Hawthorne's voice was ice cold. "Commander Garrett, I believe you've forgotten who commands Pacific Harbor." Garrett stopped, but his hands were clenched into fists. "Sir, this woman is making serious allegations without proof. For all we know, she's not even really military. She could be anyone, a foreign agent, a journalist, someone with a personal vendetta." It was a desperate play, but Garrett was a desperate man, and desperate men were dangerous. "We'll sort this out once we've reviewed the documentation," Hawthorne said. "Commander Torres, proceed with—" The overhead lights flickered once, then went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the conference room in eerie red illumination. A moment later, alarm klaxons began blaring throughout the base. "Security breach at the main armory," announced the computerized emergency system. "All personnel report to emergency stations. This is not a drill." The conference room erupted into controlled chaos as officers moved toward their emergency assignments. Elena's combat instincts kicked in immediately. She assessed exits, identified potential threats, and calculated tactical responses in the space of heartbeats. But something felt wrong. The timing was too perfect, the emergency too convenient. Elena's eyes found Torres, and she saw the same suspicion reflected in his expression. This wasn't a random security breach. This was Garrett's contingency plan. The emergency lockdown protocol required all senior officers to remain in the conference room while security teams assessed the threat. Admiral Hawthorne quickly organized the officers into their chain of command structure, assigning specific responsibilities for coordinating the response. Elena found herself in an awkward position. Her cover was blown, her actual rank was disputed, and now she was trapped in a room with 175 officers who weren't sure if she was a legitimate investigator or a fraud. Commander Garrett had positioned himself near the main exit, ostensibly to coordinate with security forces. But Elena noticed he was on his cell phone, speaking in low, urgent tones that suggested he was doing more than just responding to the emergency. Commander Reeves, Admiral Hawthorne called, out. Since you claim to have SEAL training, I'm assigning you to work with Captain Chambers on coordinating our response to the armory breach. It was a test, Elena realized. Hawthorne was giving her an opportunity to prove her claimed credentials through her actions. If she was really a former SEAL team leader, she would know how to handle a security crisis. If she was lying, it would become obvious quickly. Yes, sir, Elena replied, moving to join Chambers at the communications console. The captain was already coordinating with the base security forces, his voice calm and authoritative despite the chaos. Security Team 1, report status at the main armory. The radio crackled with static, then a tense voice responded. Team 1 at armory entrance. Door is breached, but we're not reading any personnel inside. Looks like, sir, this might be a false alarm or a diversion. Elena's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Captain, we need to check the evidence storage facility. Now. Chambers looked at her sharply. Why? Because if I were trying to destroy evidence of corruption, I wouldn't actually breach the armory. I'd create a distraction that would pull security forces away from wherever the real target was located. Chambers studied her for a moment, then keyed his radio. Security Team 2, redirect to Building 7, evidence storage. Check for any signs of intrusion. Understood, sir. Team 2 moving to Building 7 now. The wait felt eternal. Elena stood at the communications console, her mind racing through scenarios. If Garrett had orchestrated this emergency, his goal was either to destroy the physical evidence she had collected or to eliminate her as a witness. Possibly both. Captain, the radio crackled. Team 2 at Building 7. We have smoke coming from the evidence storage room on the 3rd floor. Initiating fire response. Admiral Hawthorne moved to join them at the console. What's stored in that evidence room? Physical inventory documentation, Elena said quietly, including the original requisition forms and receiving reports that document the equipment diversions. If that room burns, the physical evidence is gone. Hawthorne's expression darkened as he understood the implications. Commander Garrett, were you aware that Building 7 houses critical audit documentation? Garrett had gone very pale. Yes, sir, but I had no idea there was a fire risk. The building passed its last safety inspection. That fire didn't start itself, Commander Torres said, speaking up for the first time, and the timing is remarkably convenient. The tension in the room ratcheted up another level. Officers who had been focused on the emergency now looked between Garrett and Elena with new understanding. The situation was escalating from a corruption investigation to something that looked increasingly like sabotage and destruction of evidence. Security Team 2, Chambers called into the radio. What's the status of the fire? Under control, sir. Sprinkler system activated and fire department is on scene. But, sir, this fire was definitely set deliberately. We've got evidence of accelerant and a timing device. Hawthorne turned slowly to face Garrett. Commander, I think you need to explain exactly what's happening here. Garrett's composure was crumbling. Elena could see the calculations running behind his eyes, weighing his options, looking for escape routes, considering how far he was willing to go to protect himself. I don't have to explain anything, Garrett said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. This is a witch hunt based on the allegations of someone whose identity we still haven't verified. For all we know, she started that fire herself to support her ridiculous accusations. It was a desperate accusation, transparently false, but some of the officers looked uncertain. The situation had become so chaotic that sorting truth from lies felt impossible. Elena made a decision. She had spent 3 weeks building a cover, 3 weeks pretending to be less than she was, 3 weeks accepting condescension and dismissal, but the time for pretending was over. Admiral, Elena said, her voice carrying the command authority that she had suppressed for weeks. I recommend we secure Commander Garrett immediately and preserve the chain of custody for all evidence related to this investigation. Based on his behavior and the convenient timing of these emergencies, I believe he represents a flight risk and a potential threat to witnesses. The change in Elena's demeanor was striking. Officers who had dismissed her as a junior logistics officer now saw something different. The bearing of someone accustomed to leading troops in combat, the confidence of someone who had earned her authority through blood and sacrifice. "That's absurd," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't just arrest a senior officer based on unsubstantiated—" "The allegations are thoroughly substantiated," Elena interrupted, her voice cold. "I have 3 years of documentation. I have bank records. I have testimony from personnel who were threatened when they questioned your activities. And now I have evidence that you orchestrated false emergencies to destroy evidence and create chaos. You have nothing but conspiracy theories, and I have your own words, Commander." Elena pulled out her phone and pressed play on a recording. Garrett's voice filled the room, discussing equipment diversions with someone identified only as the buyer. The conversation was brief but damning, explicitly describing how to falsify receiving reports and coordinate payments through shell companies. The conference room went absolutely silent. Every officer present understood they had just heard recorded evidence of criminal conspiracy. Garrett's face went through several shades of red before settling on white. "That recording is inadmissible. You had no warrant to—" "I had full authorization from NCIS to conduct surveillance of personnel suspected of corruption. The recording is completely admissible, and you know it." Admiral Hawthorne stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of command. "Master-at-Arms, place Commander Garrett under arrest, pending investigation for corruption, fraud, and destruction of evidence." 2 armed security personnel moved toward Garrett, but he backed away, his hand moving toward something at his waist. Elena's combat instincts screamed warning a split second before Garrett pulled out a service pistol. "Nobody move," Garrett said, his voice shaking but his hand steady. He pointed the weapon at Admiral Hawthorne. "I'm walking out of here, and none of you are going to stop me." The room erupted in shouts and movement. Officers dove for cover behind desks and chairs. The 2 security personnel reached for their own weapons, but Elena was faster. She moved with a speed that shocked everyone present. In 3 quick steps, she closed the distance to Garrett, her left hand striking his wrist with precision that sent the pistol flying. Her right hand grabbed his elbow, and before Garrett could react, she had twisted his arm behind his back and forced him face down onto the floor. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds. One moment, Garrett had been threatening an admiral with a loaded weapon. The next, he was on the ground with Elena's knee pressed against his spine and his arm locked in a control hold that made any resistance impossible. "Don't move," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority. "I've broken 3 bones in that arm already, and I will break more if you give me a reason." Garrett gasped in pain, but stopped struggling. The security personnel rushed forward to secure him with handcuffs, but they looked at Elena with something approaching awe. Captain Chambers was the first to find his voice. "Jesus Christ, that was... Elena, where the hell did you learn to move like that?" Elena stood slowly, her breathing barely elevated despite the burst of action. "Bud's training, Captain, Class 301. I graduated 8 years ago." The room remained frozen as the implications sank in. Bud's basic underwater demolition SEAL training was legendary for its difficulty. The failure rate exceeded 75%, and Elena had just demonstrated exactly the kind of combat skills that SEAL training produced. "Commander Reeves," Admiral Hawthorne said slowly, "I believe we need to have a very long conversation about exactly who you are and what you've been investigating." The immediate crisis was over, but the real work was just beginning. Commander Garrett was transported to the base brig under armed guard. his protests growing weaker as the reality of his situation became undeniable. The fire in Building 7 had been contained with minimal damage to the evidence. The sprinkler system had activated quickly enough to protect most of the documentation. Admiral Hawthorne cleared the conference room, except for his most senior staff: Captain Chambers, Commander Torres, Sergeant Major Davis from the Marine Detachment, and Elena. The five of them stood around the large conference table while Hawthorne made a secure phone call to Naval Criminal Investigative Service headquarters in Washington. The conversation was brief and conclusive. NCIS confirmed Elena's identity, her authorization for the undercover operation, and her service record. When Hawthorne ended the call, he looked at Elena with a mixture of respect and frustration. "Commander Reeves," he said formally, "it appears I owe you an apology. Your credentials are exactly as you stated, and NCIS confirms that you've been conducting an authorized investigation into corruption at this base." "Thank you, sir," Elena replied, standing at attention. "That said," Hawthorne continued, "I'm not pleased that NCIS felt the need to conduct a covert investigation at my command without informing me. It suggests they didn't trust me to handle the situation properly. Sir, with respect, the investigation began because initial reports of corruption were ignored or suppressed by mid-level command staff. NCIS couldn't be certain how high the corruption reached, so they had to assume everyone might be compromised." Hawthorne nodded slowly, accepting the explanation if not liking it. "Walk me through what you found, Commander, and this time give me the complete picture." Over the next 2 hours, Elena presented the full scope of her investigation. She showed the 17 documented cases of equipment diversion the shell companies Garrett had established, the bank records showing his illegal profits, and the testimony from personnel who had been threatened or transferred when they questioned his activities. The evidence was overwhelming. Garrett had stolen approximately $18 million in military equipment over 3 years, selling it to foreign buyers through intermediary companies. He had used his position and reputation to suppress investigations, intimidate witnesses, and eliminate anyone who threatened his operation. "How did he think he would get away with this?" Captain Chambers asked. "Because he had been getting away with it for 3 years, Elena replied. He was careful, sophisticated, and protected by relationships he'd built over 25 years of service. Most people couldn't believe that a decorated officer would be corrupt, so they found other explanations for the discrepancies. Like blaming inexperienced auditors," Torres added quietly. "Exactly. Garrett understood that institutional bias would work in his favor. A junior female officer making serious accusations against a senior male officer, the default assumption would be that she was mistaken or overreaching." Sergeant Major Davis, who had been silent throughout the briefing, spoke up. "Commander Reeves, I've been around long enough to know that what you did today took more than just combat training. You maintained your cover for weeks while being dismissed and condescended to. That requires a different kind of courage than facing enemy fire." Elena met the older woman's eyes, seeing understanding there. Davis had fought her own battles against institutional bias, and she recognized what Elena had endured. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," Elena said simply. "I do have one question," Chambers said. "When Garrett pulled that weapon, you moved faster than I've ever seen anyone move outside of combat. How did you know he was going to draw?" Elena considered her answer carefully. "Body language, sir." Garrett's posture shifted right before he reached for the weapon. His weight moved back, his right shoulder dropped slightly, and his breathing changed. In close quarters combat training, you learn to read those micro signals because they can mean the difference between life and death. And the disarm technique? Krav Maga combined with joint lock principles from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The goal is to control the weapon and the person simultaneously. Once I had his wrist secured and his elbow hyperextended, he had 2 choices: drop the weapon or suffer a compound fracture. Chambers whistled softly. Remind me never to get on your bad side. The tension in the room eased slightly as exhausted relief replaced crisis adrenaline. Admiral Hawthorne stood and walked to the window, looking out over the base that had nearly been torn apart by corruption. Commander Reeves, he said without turning around, your investigation has exposed serious failures in our oversight and accountability systems. Those failures allowed Garrett's corruption to flourish for far too long. I want you to know that I take responsibility for creating an environment where this could happen. Sir, the corruption was Garrett's responsibility, not yours. The corruption was his responsibility, Hawthorne agreed, turning to face her. But the culture that allowed it to continue was mine. We failed to create adequate reporting mechanisms. We failed to take seriously the concerns raised by junior personnel, and we failed to question a senior officer's activities even when discrepancies were obvious. He paused, his expression grave. That ends today. I'm implementing immediate reforms to our oversight processes, creating protected channels for reporting corruption, and ensuring that serious allegations are investigated regardless of who they're made against. Continued in next section. Commander Torres cleared his throat. Admiral, there's something else we need to address. Over the past 72 hours, there have been 3 additional incidents that may be connected to Garrett's operation. What kind of incidents? Lieutenant Shaw's car suffered brake failure. The mechanics found evidence of deliberate tampering. Commander Peterson, who previously served here, filed a report with Norfolk PD about receiving threatening messages, and Captain Brennan, who was reassigned to Alaska, contacted me yesterday, saying he believes his quarters were searched and classified documents were planted there. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Garrett hadn't just been corrupt. He had been actively eliminating threats through intimidation, sabotage, and framing innocent officers. Jesus, Hawthorne whispered. How many people did he hurt? We won't know until we interview everyone who questioned his activities over the past 3 years, Elena said. But based on Torres's documentation, I'd estimate at least a dozen officers. Some officers were either transferred, threatened, or had their careers damaged because they got too close to exposing the corruption. I want every one of those cases reviewed, Hawthorne said firmly. Anyone who was wrongly transferred or disciplined because of Garrett's retaliation will have those actions reversed and will receive formal apologies. And if any of them want to press charges against Garrett for harassment or intimidation, the Navy will support those prosecutions fully. It was exactly the kind of leadership response Elena had hoped for but hadn't expected. Hawthorne was taking responsibility and implementing real change rather than just protecting the institution's reputation. Sir, Elena said, there's one more thing. The recording I played earlier, I didn't capture that during my investigation here. Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. Where did it come from? Lieutenant Foster, my office mate. He'd been documenting Garrett's phone conversations for 6 months, using recording equipment he purchased himself. He knew something was wrong but didn't feel safe reporting it through official channels. When I arrived and started asking questions, he eventually decided to trust me with what he'd collected. Foster did that? Chambers looked surprised. I always thought he just kept his head down and processed paperwork. He did keep his head down, Elena said, because he has a family to protect and couldn't afford to lose his job. But he also couldn't stand by and watch corruption destroy the institution he'd dedicated his career to serving. He did what he could safely do, and it made all the difference in building this case. Torres nodded slowly. There are probably dozens of people on this base who saw pieces of what Garrett was doing but felt powerless to stop it. The culture we created made them afraid to speak up. Then we changed the culture, Hawthorne said firmly, starting today. The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the door. A young ensign entered, looking nervous. Admiral Hawthorne, sir, the base security director needs to speak with you urgently. There's been a development with Commander Garrett. Hawthorne's expression darkened. What kind of development? Garrett's attorney has arrived, sir, and he's demanding that Commander Garrett be released immediately, claiming his arrest was illegal and that the evidence against him was obtained through unauthorized surveillance. Elena felt her stomach tighten. She had known this was coming. Garrett had connections, resources, and lawyers who knew how to exploit procedural technicalities. The battle was far from over. "Tell the security director I'll be there in 5 minutes," Hawthorne said. After the ensign left, he turned to Elena. "Commander, I need you to be absolutely certain that every piece of evidence you collected was obtained legally and in accordance with your authorization from NCIS. It was, sir. I have documentation for every surveillance activity, every database search, every interview. NCIS Legal reviewed the protocols before I began the investigation." "Good, because Garrett's lawyers are going to challenge everything. And if there's even one procedural violation, they'll try to get the entire case dismissed." As they prepared to confront Garrett's attorney, Elena felt the weight of the past 3 weeks settling on her shoulders. She had sacrificed her cover, endured condescension and dismissal, and nearly been killed by Garrett's desperate attempt to destroy evidence. But the investigation was only half complete. Now came the harder part, ensuring that Garrett actually faced consequences for his crimes. The group moved toward the security office where Garrett's attorney was waiting. But as they walked down the corridor, they encountered something unexpected. A formation of approximately 50 enlisted personnel had gathered in the main hallway. When Admiral Hawthorne appeared, they snapped to attention in perfect unison. But their attention wasn't focused on the Admiral. It was focused on Elena. Petty Officer First Class Martinez stepped forward from the formation. Elena recognized her as one of the women who had filed an informal complaint about Garrett's harassment. "Commander Reeves," Martinez said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent corridor. "Permission to speak, ma'am." Elena glanced at Admiral Hawthorne, who nodded slightly. "Permission granted," Elena said. "Ma'am, we just wanted you to know what you did today mattered for all of us. You stood up to someone everyone else was afraid to challenge. You proved that the system could work if people had the courage to use it, and you showed every woman on this base that we don't have to accept being underestimated or dismissed." Martinez's voice was steady but emotional. Around her, the other enlisted personnel nodded in agreement. "We've been talking," Martinez continued, "and we want you to know that if you need witnesses, if you need testimony, if you need anything to make sure Garrett faces justice, we're ready to stand with you." Elena felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. She had spent 3 weeks alone, pretending to be someone she wasn't, bearing the weight of the investigation in isolation. The idea that she wasn't actually alone, that these sailors had been watching and hoping and waiting for someone to take action, it was overwhelming. "Thank you, Petty Officer," Elena said, keeping her voice professional despite the emotion threatening to break through. "Your courage in speaking up, in documenting what you witnessed, in refusing to accept corruption as normal, that's what made this investigation possible. I'm honored to serve with all of you." The formation remained at attention as Admiral Hawthorne and his staff continued toward the security office. But as Elena passed, she heard Martinez whisper, "Hooyah, Commander." It was the SEAL battle cry, and hearing it from a sailor who would never attend BUDS training, but who understood what it meant to refuse to quit, that meant more to Elena than any medal or commendation ever could. But the moment of emotional connection was shattered by what they found at the security office. Garrett's attorney was exactly what Elena had expected, an expensive civilian lawyer in a $3,000 suit who specialized in defending military officers accused of corruption. His name was Marcus Wellington, and his reputation was well known in NCIS circles. He won cases not through brilliant legal arguments, but through exploiting procedural technicalities and intimidating witnesses. "Admiral Hawthorne," Wellington said without preamble, "my client is being held in violation of his constitutional rights. I demand his immediate release. Your client was arrested after pulling a loaded weapon on a superior officer in front of 175 witnesses, Hawthorne replied coldly. His rights have been scrupulously protected, and he's being held in accordance with military law. The arrest was based on allegations made by an individual whose identity and credentials were not verified at the time, Wellington countered. Furthermore, my client contends that this so-called Commander Reeves conducted unauthorized surveillance and fabricated evidence to support a vendetta against him. Elena stepped forward, her voice calm. Mr. Wellington, my identity and credentials have been verified by NCIS headquarters. My authorization for surveillance activities was properly documented and approved by the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. And the evidence against your client includes his own recorded admissions of criminal activity. Wellington's eyes narrowed as he assessed Elena. She could see him recalibrating his strategy, realizing that she wasn't going to be easily intimidated or dismissed. I'll need to review all documentation related to your alleged authorization, Wellington said. Until then, I'm advising my client not to make any statements. That's his right, Hawthorne agreed, but he remains in custody pending formal charges. The evidence against him is substantial, and given his attempt to flee using a weapon, he represents a clear flight risk. Wellington's jaw tightened. We'll see what a military judge has to say about that. I'm filing for an emergency hearing on bail and challenging the admissibility of all evidence obtained through surveillance. As Wellington turned to leave, he paused beside Elena. You should be very careful, Commander. My client has friends in high places, and they're not going to appreciate seeing a decorated officer destroyed by someone conducting a witch hunt. It was a threat, barely disguised as friendly advice. Elena met Wellington's eyes without flinching. Your client stole $18 million in military equipment and threatened or harmed at least a dozen officers who questioned his activities. The only thing being destroyed here is a criminal enterprise that should never have been allowed to flourish. Wellington's expression hardened. We'll see who the criminals are when this is over. After he left, Captain Chambers let out a low whistle. That guy is going to be a problem. He's going to try to be a problem, Elena corrected. But the evidence is solid, the authorization is documented, and there are too many witnesses for him to intimidate everyone. Garrett's going to prison. It's just a question of how long the legal process takes. Admiral Hawthorne nodded slowly. Commander Reeves, I know you've been operating undercover for weeks, and you're probably exhausted, but I need you to stay at Pacific Harbor until this case is fully resolved. We'll need your testimony, your expertise, and frankly, your presence to reassure personnel that standing up to corruption won't destroy their careers. Elena had hoped to return to her actual assignment after the investigation concluded, but she understood Hawthorne's reasoning. I'll stay as long as necessary, sir. Good. Commander Torres, I want you to work with Commander Reeves to document every aspect of this investigation. Captain Chambers, coordinate with NCIS to ensure all evidence is properly preserved and chain of custody is maintained. Sergeant Major Davis, I want statements from every enlisted person who witnessed Garrett's harassment or intimidation. As the meeting broke up and officers dispersed to their assigned tasks, Elena found herself alone in the corridor with Commander Torres. You did a hell of a thing today, Torres said quietly. A lot of people wanted Garrett stopped, but you're the only one who actually made it happen. I had help, Elena replied. Your documentation, Foster's recordings, Martina's willingness to testify. This wasn't a solo operation. Maybe not. But you were the one who had the courage to put your career on the line. That matters. Torres headed toward his office, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. The past 3 weeks had been among the most challenging of her career, not because of physical danger, which she was trained to handle, but because of the psychological toll of pretending to be less than she was, accepting dismissal and condescension, watching people underestimate her while she quietly built a case that would end a criminal enterprise. She had done what she came here to do. Garrett was in custody, the evidence was secured, and reforms were being implemented. It should have felt like victory, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Wellington's confidence had been too absolute, his threats too specific. Garrett had connections in high places, resources Elena might not be aware of, and 3 weeks to prepare contingency plans. The investigation was over. But Elena's instincts, honed through years of combat operations, told her that the real danger was just beginning. 3 hours after Garrett's arrest, Admiral Hawthorne called an emergency all-hands briefing. Every officer on the base, all 175 of them, was required to attend. The official purpose was to address the security breaches and provide guidance on the ongoing investigation. But Elena suspected Hawthorne had another motive. He wanted the entire command to see that corruption would not be tolerated and that those who exposed it would be protected rather than punished. The conference room was packed beyond capacity. Officers stood along the walls when chairs ran out, and the atmosphere was electric with tension and speculation. News of Garrett's arrest had spread through the base like wildfire, and everyone had theories about what had really happened. Elena arrived early, taking her previous seat near the back. Despite her newly revealed rank, she wasn't trying to hide anymore, but old habits of tactical positioning died hard. From her vantage point, she could observe the entire room and all entrances. As officers filed in, Elena noticed something unexpected. Many of them, particularly the women and younger personnel, nodded respectfully in her direction or found excuses to walk past and offer quiet words of thanks. Her exposure of Garrett's corruption had resonated far beyond the immediate investigation. She had become a symbol of something larger, the possibility that the system could work, that speaking truth to power didn't have to mean career suicide, that courage could actually make a difference. But not everyone viewed her actions positively. Elena noticed a cluster of senior officers near the front who were engaged in intense conversation, occasionally glancing in her direction with expressions that ranged from suspicion to hostility. She recognized several of them as Garrett's longtime associates, officers who had benefited from his influence and who now faced uncomfortable questions about whether they had been complicit in his corruption. Admiral Hawthorne entered at precisely 1400 hours, accompanied by Commander Torres and Captain Chambers. The room snapped to attention, then settled into expectant silence as Hawthorne took his position at the podium. "At ease," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "What I'm about to tell you will be shocking to some and unsurprising to others. This morning, Commander Marcus Garrett was arrested on charges of corruption, fraud, equipment diversion, and attempted destruction of evidence. The investigation that led to his arrest was conducted by Commander Elena Reeves, who has been operating undercover at this base for the past 3 weeks, under authorization from Naval Criminal Investigative Service." A murmur rippled through the room. Even those who had witnessed the morning's events were hearing the full scope for the first time. Commander Reeves's investigation uncovered systematic diversion of military equipment valued at approximately $18 million over 3 years. Commander Garrett established shell companies to receive and resell this equipment to foreign buyers, falsifying documentation to conceal the theft. When his activities were questioned by junior personnel, he used intimidation, threats, and retaliation to silence them. Hawthorne paused, letting the magnitude sink in. "This happened at my command, under my watch. I take full responsibility for creating an environment where such corruption could flourish. Effective immediately, we are implementing comprehensive reforms to our oversight and accountability systems. No officer, regardless of rank or tenure, will be above scrutiny, and any personnel who report corruption or misconduct will be protected from retaliation." The Admiral continued with specific details about the new reporting mechanisms, protection protocols, and oversight procedures. Elena listened carefully, impressed by how thoroughly Hawthorne was addressing the systemic failures rather than just treating Garrett as an isolated bad actor. As the briefing approached its conclusion, Hawthorne made an unexpected announcement. "I want to personally recognize Commander Elena Reeves for her courage in conducting this investigation. She operated alone, endured condescension and dismissal, and maintained her cover even when doing so required accepting treatment that no officer should have to tolerate. Her dedication to exposing corruption, regardless of personal cost, exemplifies the best traditions of naval service. Commander Reeves, please stand." Elena rose, feeling every eye in the room fix on her. The moment felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been a dismissed junior logistics officer. Now she was being publicly commended by a 3-star admiral. "The Navy needs more officers like Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said. "People who put mission and integrity above personal advancement, who have the courage to speak truth even when their silence would be easier, who refuse to accept corruption as normal. I hope every person in this room will remember her example the next time they face a choice between convenience and courage." The room erupted in applause. Elena saw genuine admiration in many faces, though she also noticed the cluster of Garrett's associates remained conspicuously silent. As the briefing concluded and officers began filing out, Elena felt a presence beside her. She turned to find Captain Richard Morrison, one of Garrett's closest associates, standing uncomfortably close. Morrison was 53 years old with 30 years of service, and his expression suggested he had something he urgently needed to say. "Commander Reeves," Morrison said, his voice low and tight with barely controlled anger, "I need to have a word with you, privately." Elena's tactical instincts immediately went on alert. Morrison's body language was aggressive. Shoulders tense, hands clenched, breathing shallow. This wasn't a friendly conversation. "Of course, Captain," Elena replied calmly, "though I should mention that after a briefing like this, I typically grab coffee in the senior officers' lounge. We could talk there if you'd like." It was a deliberate choice. The senior officers' lounge would be populated with witnesses, reducing the risk of Morrison doing something he'd regret. But Morrison seemed to miss the implication entirely. "Fine, the lounge works." They walked in silence through the corridors, Morrison maintaining a pace slightly too fast to be comfortable, forcing Elena to keep up. More power games, Elena recognized. Morrison was trying to assert dominance through small physical gestures. The senior officers' lounge was a spacious room with comfortable furniture, a well-maintained coffee station, and a wall of windows overlooking the parade ground. When Elena and Morrison entered, approximately 30 other officers were already there, engaged in quiet conversations about the morning's dramatic events. Elena moved toward the coffee station, pouring herself a cup while Morrison positioned himself between her and the main exit. More tactical positioning. He was cutting off her easiest escape route. Whatever he wanted to say, he was prepared to be physically intimidating about it. "So, Captain," Elena said pleasantly, stirring cream into her coffee, "what did you want to discuss?" Morrison glanced around the room, noting the other officers who were trying not to obviously listen to their conversation. He lowered his voice, but his intensity was palpable. "You destroyed the career of one of the finest officers I've ever served with," Morrison said, each word clipped with anger. "Marcus Garrett is a decorated veteran with 25 years of honorable service, and you've ruined his life based on some accounting discrepancies and conspiracy theories." Elena took a sip of her coffee, buying herself a moment to formulate her response. She could see other officers in the lounge beginning to pay closer attention to the confrontation. "Captain Morrison," Elena said calmly, "Commander Garrett was arrested because he stole $18 million in military equipment and threatened personnel who questioned his activities. Those aren't accounting discrepancies or conspiracy theories. Those are documented crimes with substantial evidence. Evidence you supposedly collected while lying about your identity and spying on your fellow officers, Morrison countered. You come here under false pretenses. You violate the trust that should exist between service members, and then you have the audacity to stand there and act like you're some kind of hero. His voice had risen slightly, drawing more attention from around the room. Elena remained calm, recognizing that Morrison was trying to provoke an emotional reaction that would make her look unstable or vindictive. I operated under proper authorization from NCIS, Elena said evenly. My cover was necessary because initial reports of corruption had been suppressed by mid-level command staff. The investigation was conducted legally and ethically. Legally? You recorded private conversations without consent. You accessed confidential files under false credentials. You built your case through deception and betrayal. Morrison stepped closer, invading Elena's personal space in a clear act of intimidation. And now you expect us to thank you for destroying a good man's career? Elena held her ground, maintaining eye contact without backing away. Commander Garrett destroyed his own career when he chose to steal from the military he swore to serve. I simply documented his crimes and brought them to light. That's your version, Morrison said, his face flushing with anger. But there are a lot of us who think you're nothing more than an opportunist who saw a chance to make a name for yourself by taking down a senior officer. How convenient that you discovered all this corruption right after arriving here, almost like you were looking for someone to target. The accusation was absurd, but Elena recognized it as Morrison's attempt to salvage Garrett's reputation by discrediting her. If he could plant seeds of doubt about her motivations, he might be able to undermine the case. Captain, Elena said, her voice taking on an edge of authority, Commander Garrett's crimes are documented through his own recorded admissions, bank records showing illegal profits, and testimony from multiple witnesses. My motivations are irrelevant to the evidence. Your motivations are completely relevant, Morrison shot back, because what you did was a witch hunt. You came here with preconceptions. You selectively interpreted evidence to support your narrative, and you destroyed a decorated officer's life to advance your own career. Elena felt her patience beginning to fray. Morrison was deliberately mischaracterizing both her investigation and Garrett's crimes, presumably because he was worried about being implicated himself. But before she could respond, Morrison made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He grabbed Elena's wrist, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to cross the line from aggressive conversation to physical assault. You need to understand something, Morrison said, his face inches from hers. Marcus Garrett has friends, powerful friends, and they're not going to let some ambitious female officer destroy his reputation without consequences. You think you've won, but this is just beginning. By the time we're done with you, your career will be... Elena could have ended the confrontation there. She could have simply removed Morrison's hand from her wrist using non-injurious control techniques. She could have called for security, filed a report, and let the system handle his assault. But Morrison made one final, catastrophic mistake. He picked up his coffee cup, a large ceramic mug filled with steaming liquid, and deliberately poured it down the front of Elena's uniform. The scalding coffee soaked through her khaki shirt instantly, burning her skin through the fabric. The shock of it, the deliberate malice, the public humiliation, the physical pain triggered something primal in Elena's training and instincts. The 30 officers in the lounge would later give remarkably consistent testimony about what happened next. They would describe how Commander Reeves moved with a speed that seemed almost impossible, how her right hand caught Captain Morrison's extended arm, how she pivoted and used his own momentum against him, and how Morrison's elbow bent in a direction that no joint was designed to move. The sound was distinctive, a wet crack that echoed through the suddenly silent lounge, followed immediately by Morrison's scream of agony. Morrison collapsed to his knees, clutching his shattered elbow, His face had gone white with shock and pain. The coffee cup lay shattered on the floor beside him, its contents mixing with the growing pool of liquid dripping from Elena's ruined uniform. Elena stood over Morrison's fallen form, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Her chest and stomach burned where the coffee had soaked through, but her voice was calm and controlled when she spoke. "Captain Morrison," Elena said, loud enough for every officer in the lounge to hear clearly, "you just committed assault in front of 30 witnesses. You grabbed me without consent. You poured scalding liquid on me with the intent to cause harm, and you threatened retaliation for my role in a legitimate criminal investigation. I defended myself using minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat you represented." Morrison tried to speak, but only managed a strangled moan of pain. His elbow was already swelling, the joint bent at an unnatural angle that made several watching officers wince. Commander Torres, who had been in the lounge the entire time, moved forward quickly. "Medical team to the senior officers' lounge immediately," he called into his radio. Then to the assembled officers, "I need everyone who witnessed this incident to remain here to provide statements." No one moved. The shock of what they had just seen had frozen them in place. Elena remained standing over Morrison, waiting for security to arrive, her mind already moving through the aftermath she knew was coming. She had just broken a senior officer's arm, in self-defense, yes, with ample witnesses to confirm he had assaulted her first, yes, but the optics were undeniable. A female officer had physically dominated and injured a male superior in a room full of witnesses. The political and professional consequences would be significant, regardless of how justified her actions had been. But as Elena looked down at Morrison, this man who had poured coffee on her to defend his corrupt friend, who had assaulted her because he couldn't accept that his ally was a criminal, she felt no regret. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the most difficult thing to do, and sometimes justice required decisive action rather than endless deliberation. The medics arrived within 3 minutes, followed closely by master-at-arms personnel to secure the scene. Morrison was loaded onto a stretcher, still semi-conscious from pain and shock. His shattered elbow would require surgery and months of rehabilitation. Admiral Hawthorne appeared shortly after, his expression grave as he surveyed the scene. Coffee still dripping from Elena's uniform, Morrison being wheeled out on a stretcher, 30 shocked officers providing statements to security. "Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said quietly, "what happened here?" Elena stood at attention, her uniform soaked and her skin still burning, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, Captain Morrison assaulted me by grabbing my wrist and pouring hot coffee on my uniform. I responded with defensive force to neutralize the threat. There are approximately 30 witnesses who can corroborate my account." Hawthorne nodded slowly, then turned to Commander Torres. "Is that consistent with what you observed?" "Yes, sir," Torres replied without hesitation. "Captain Morrison grabbed Commander Reeves without consent and deliberately poured coffee on her. Her response was instantaneous self-defense. If she hadn't acted, I believe Morrison would have continued his assault." Other officers began confirming the account, their testimonies remarkably consistent. Morrison had initiated physical contact. Morrison had poured the coffee. Morrison had been aggressive and threatening. Elena had defended herself. "Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said, "you're going to medical to have those burns treated. Then you're going to write a detailed report of this incident. Captain Morrison will be placed under arrest when he's released from surgery. And we're going to have a very serious conversation about the culture at this command that led to a senior officer thinking he could assault a subordinate without consequences." As Elena was escorted to the medical facility, she caught fragments of conversation from the officers still in the lounge. "Did you see how fast she moved? Morrison never saw it coming. I can't believe he was stupid enough to assault her after everything that happened with Garrett. She's a SEAL. What did he think was going to happen?" The story would spread through the base within hours. Commander Elena Reeves, the undercover SEAL who had exposed corruption, who had stood up to a criminal officer who had defended herself when attacked, had now added another chapter to her legend. But as Elena sat in the medical facility while doctors treated her burns, she felt only exhaustion. The investigation was complete. Garrett and Morrison were both in custody. The evidence was preserved. Justice would be served. But the personal cost had been significant. 3 weeks of living a lie, accepting condescension and dismissal, watching good people suffer in silence. And now this, physically defending herself against an assault that should never have occurred. Elena had accomplished her mission, but she wondered as the burn medication numbed her skin whether the victory had been worth the price. The answer, she decided, would depend on what happened next. If the reforms Admiral Hawthorne had promised actually materialized, if the culture actually changed, if junior personnel actually felt safe reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation, then yes, it had been worth it. But if things simply returned to normal once the scandal faded, if Garrett and Morrison's arrests were treated as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of systemic problems, then all of this would have been for nothing. Time would tell. The base medical facility was quiet at 16:30 hours. Elena sat on an examination table while Lieutenant Commander Rachel Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison, thankfully, applied burn ointment to her chest and stomach. The coffee had caused second-degree burns across approximately 15% of her torso, painful but not life-threatening. "You're lucky," Dr. Morrison said, her tone professional but sympathetic. "Another few degrees hotter and we'd be looking at third-degree burns requiring skin grafts. As it is, you'll heal completely in 2 to 3 weeks with proper care." "Lucky," Elena repeated, the word tasting bitter. She hadn't felt lucky since arriving at Pacific Harbor 3 weeks ago. "Commander," Dr. Morrison said quietly, as she wrapped gauze around Elena's torso, "I want you to know that what you did today, what you've been doing since you arrived, it matters. To all of us." Elena looked up, surprised by the emotion in the doctor's voice. "I've been at this base for 4 years," Dr. Morrison continued. "In that time, I've treated 3 female officers for injuries that were officially classified as training accidents, but that I strongly suspected were assault. I documented my concerns, filed reports with the proper authorities, and watched nothing happen because the perpetrators were senior officers with powerful friends." She finished wrapping the gauze and stepped back, meeting Elena's eyes. "You stopped that. You proved that the system could work if someone had the courage to use it. And when Morrison attacked you today, you showed every woman on this base that we don't have to accept being victims." Before Elena could respond, there was a knock on the examination room door. Master Chief Petty, Officer Jennifer Hayes, entered, her expression uncharacteristically emotional. "Commander Reeves," Hayes said, "there's something happening outside that I think you need to see." Elena pulled on a clean uniform shirt. Dr. Morrison had cut the coffee-stained one off her and followed Hayes to the medical facility's main entrance. What she found there stopped her cold. Approximately 200 personnel had gathered in the parking lot outside. Sailors, Marines, junior officers, senior enlisted, a cross-section of the base's population, all standing in informal formation. When Elena appeared in the doorway, they snapped to attention as one. Then, starting with Master Chief Hayes and rippling through the formation like a wave, they saluted. It wasn't the routine salute of military protocol. This was something different, held longer than regulation required, offered with an intensity that spoke of genuine respect rather than obligatory courtesy. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the unexpected display. Petty Officer First Class Martinez stepped forward from the formation. "Commander Reeves, permission to speak, ma'am?" Elena's throat felt tight, but she managed to respond. "Granted." Ma'am, we wanted you to know that we stand with you. What happened today in the officers' lounge? Everyone knows Captain Morrison assaulted you, and everyone knows you defended yourself appropriately. But we also know that sometimes the truth gets twisted, that sometimes people who do the right thing end up being punished for it. Martinez's voice carried clearly across the parking lot. So we're here to make it absolutely clear. We witnessed what you've done for this base. We know you exposed corruption that was hurting all of us. We know you endured weeks of being dismissed and underestimated while you quietly built your case. And we know that when you were attacked today, your response was justified and necessary. Another voice spoke up from the formation, Petty Officer Second Class Chen, one of the women who had filed harassment complaints against Garrett. If anyone tries to retaliate against you, Commander, they're going to have to go through all of us first. The statement was met with a chorus of agreement from the assembled personnel. Elena felt emotion threatening to overwhelm her professional composure. She had spent 3 weeks operating alone, bearing the weight of the investigation in isolation, accepting that her actions would likely make her a pariah among officers who valued institutional loyalty above justice. But she hadn't been alone. These sailors had been watching, documenting, hoping, and waiting for someone to take action. And now they were publicly declaring their support, creating a protective barrier around her that would make retaliation much more difficult. Thank you, Elena said, her voice carrying despite its roughness. All of you. What you're doing right now, standing up, speaking out, refusing to accept corruption as normal. This is what changes institutions, not investigations or arrests or policy reforms, but people like you who decide that courage matters more than convenience. She paused, looking at the faces before her. Young sailors fresh out of boot camp standing beside grizzled master chiefs with 30 years of service. Men and women from every rate and specialty, united by a shared belief that the Navy they served should live up to its ideals. The investigation is complete, Elena continued. Commander Garrett and Captain Morrison are in custody, but the real work is just beginning, because systems don't change unless people change them, and that means every one of you has a responsibility to speak up when you see misconduct, to support those who report problems, and to refuse to accept that rank or tenure puts someone above accountability. Master Chief Hayes stepped forward again. We understand, Commander, and we're ready to do our part. She paused, then added with a slight smile, also, the video footage from the officers' lounge has been viewed approximately 300 times in the last 2 hours. Your defensive technique was textbook perfect, ma'am. You've got a lot of people wanting to know where they can learn to move like that. Despite everything, Elena felt herself smile. Bud's training, Master Chief, but I don't particularly recommend it. The failure rate is brutal. Maybe, Hayes replied, but those who make it through know how to handle themselves when situations get rough. We're grateful to have you here, Commander. The formation held their salutes as Elena returned the gesture. Then, as she lowered her hand, they broke into spontaneous applause. Not the polite applause of formal ceremonies, but the genuine enthusiasm of people celebrating something they believed in. As the crowd began to disperse, Elena found herself approached by individual sailors offering words of support, thanks, and encouragement. Many shared stories of their own encounters with corruption or harassment, incidents they had been afraid to report until seeing that someone could actually hold powerful people accountable. It was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Inspiring because these sailors were finding their voices and their courage. Heartbreaking because their stories revealed just how pervasive the problems had been. Elena was still talking with personnel in the parking lot when Admiral Hawthorne's sedan pulled up. The Admiral emerged, taking in the scene with an expression that mixed surprise with approval. "Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said as he approached, "when I heard that 200 personnel had gathered outside the medical facility, I was concerned there might be some kind of protest. I'm pleased to see I was wrong." "They're not protesting, sir," Elena replied. They're declaring their support for the investigation and their commitment to the reforms you announced. Hawthorne nodded slowly, studying the departing sailors. This is unprecedented in my experience. I've seen personnel rally behind commanders during crises or deployments, but I've never seen anything like this in response to an internal investigation. Perhaps that's because internal investigations usually target the powerless rather than the powerful, Master Chief Hayes suggested quietly. When personnel see that the system actually works, that courage is rewarded rather than punished, they respond. A fair point, Master Chief, Hawthorne acknowledged. He turned to Elena. Commander, I need you to come to my office. There have been developments regarding your encounter with Captain Morrison. Elena felt her stomach tighten. What kind of developments, sir? The kind we need to discuss in private. Admiral Hawthorne's office was spacious but austere, decorated with memorabilia from 3 decades of naval service. When Elena entered, she found not just Hawthorne, but also Captain Chambers, Commander Torres, and 2 civilians she didn't recognize. Commander Reeves, Hawthorne said, gesturing to the civilians. This is Special Agent Catherine Walsh from NCIS and Assistant United States Attorney Michael Chen from the Southern District. They've been reviewing the events of the past 24 hours. Elena shook hands with both civilians, noting the careful neutrality of their expressions. This was either very good or very bad. Commander Reeves, Agent Walsh began, your handling of the investigation into Commander Garrett was exemplary. The evidence you collected is comprehensive, well documented, and will absolutely support criminal prosecution. The Deputy Chief of Naval Operations has personally commended your work. Thank you, ma'am, Elena replied carefully, waiting for the other shoe to drop. However, Walsh continued, and there it was. Your encounter with Captain Morrison this afternoon has created complications. Morrison's attorney is claiming that you used excessive force in defending yourself, and that your response was motivated by anger rather than genuine self-defense. Elena felt cold fury building in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Captain Morrison grabbed me without consent and poured scalding coffee on me with the intent to cause injury. I responded with defensive force appropriate to neutralize the threat. There were approximately 30 witnesses who can confirm this sequence of events. We've interviewed 23 of those witnesses, AUSA Chen said. Their accounts are remarkably consistent and support your version of events. The problem is that Morrison's attorney is arguing that your SEAL training gave you alternative options for defense that wouldn't have resulted in a shattered elbow. That's absurd, Captain Chambers interjected. Commander Reeves was being actively assaulted. She's not required to calculate the least injurious defensive response while hot coffee is being poured on her. I agree completely, Chen replied. And under normal circumstances, this would be open and shut self-defense, with no question of criminal charges. But Morrison's attorney is Marcus Wellington, the same lawyer representing Commander Garrett. He's making this about you rather than about his client's assault, suggesting that you have a pattern of excessive aggression toward senior officers. Elena understood the strategy immediately. Wellington couldn't defend Garrett's crimes. The evidence was too overwhelming, but he could try to discredit Elena's credibility by portraying her as violent and unstable. If he succeeded, it might create reasonable doubt about whether her investigation had been objective or motivated by personal vendetta. So what are you recommending? Elena asked quietly. Agent Walsh leaned forward. We're recommending that you be placed on administrative leave pending a formal review of both incidents, the confrontation with Garrett and the encounter with Morrison. The review will be conducted by an independent board, and you'll have full opportunity to present your case. Administrative leave, Elena repeated, which will look to the base population like I'm being punished for defending myself, which will undermine the reforms Admiral Hawthorne announced, which will send a message that exposing corruption actually does end careers. That's not the intent, Walsh protested, but Elena could see the uncomfortable acknowledgement in her eyes. Maybe not, but that will be the result. Elena looked at Admiral Hawthorne. Sir, what's your position on this? Hawthorne was silent for a long moment, his expression troubled. Commander, if I could make this decision unilaterally, I would tell Wellington and his client to go to hell and give you a medal for both exposing corruption and defending yourself from assault. But I don't have that authority. The chain of command extends above me, and there are political considerations that I can't ignore. Political considerations, Elena said, tasting the bitterness of the phrase. You mean that Commander Garrett and Captain Morrison have powerful friends who are pressuring the Navy to make this problem disappear? Yes, Hawthorne admitted. That's exactly what I mean. And those friends are using their influence to demand that you be investigated, potentially charged, and at minimum removed from this command. Elena felt the exhaustion of the past 3 weeks crashing over her. She had endured dismissal and condescension. She had gathered evidence that would send corrupt officers to prison. She had been assaulted and had defended herself appropriately, and now she was being told that she might face charges because powerful people wanted to protect their friends. Commander Reeves, a USHN said gently, I want to be very clear about something. We believe your investigation was exemplary, and your self-defense was completely justified. The review is a formality designed to satisfy political pressure, not a genuine question about your conduct. We fully expect you to be cleared of any wrongdoing. But in the meantime, Elena said, I'm placed on leave, which sends a message that reporting corruption and defending yourself from assault are questionable actions. And that message will be heard by every junior officer and enlisted person on this base. No one in the room disputed her assessment. Commander Torres spoke up, his voice angry. This is exactly the kind of institutional cowardice that allowed Garrett's corruption to flourish for 3 years. We talk about accountability and reform, but when powerful people push back, we cave to political pressure. I don't disagree, Hawthorne said wearily, but I also don't have the authority to fight the entire chain of command. Sometimes you have to accept tactical losses to win strategic victories. Elena looked at the Admiral, seeing the genuine regret in his expression. Hawthorne was a good officer caught in a bad system, trying to do the right thing while navigating political realities that made that nearly impossible. Sir, Elena said quietly, I'll accept administrative leave on one condition. What condition? That you make it absolutely clear to the base population that the leave is administrative procedure, not punishment, that you continue implementing the reforms you announced, and that you protect the personnel who supported my investigation from any retaliation. Hawthorne nodded immediately. You have my word on all 3 points. In fact, I'm going to issue a command-wide statement within the hour, making those exact points. Then I'll comply with the recommendation, Elena said, though the words felt like surrender. Agent Walsh pulled out a folder. There's one more thing. We've been reviewing Commander Garrett's phone records and financial documents. He made several calls to a number registered to Vice Admiral Harold Peterson at the Pentagon. The name sent a chill through Elena. Vice Admiral Peterson was the head of Naval Personnel Management, one of the most powerful positions in the Navy. He had direct authority over assignment decisions, promotions, and career trajectories for every officer in the service. What was the nature of those calls? Elena asked. We don't have recordings, but the timing suggests Garrett was reaching out to Peterson for protection. The calls increased in frequency after you arrived at Pacific Harbor, and the last call was made 3 hours before Garrett pulled a weapon on Admiral Hawthorne. So Peterson knew about the corruption, Commander Torres said. We can't prove that yet, Chen replied carefully, but the phone records are suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. We're expanding our inquiry to include Peterson's potential involvement. Elena felt a grim satisfaction. If Peterson had been protecting Garrett, his career was about to end just as spectacularly. But it also meant that the political pressure to discredit her investigation was coming from very high up the chain of command. "How long will the administrative review take?" Elena asked. 2 to 3 weeks, Agent Walsh replied. "We'll expedite it as much as possible, but due process requires a thorough examination." "Understood." The meeting concluded shortly after, with handshakes and reassurances that felt hollow in the face of political reality. As Elena left Hawthorne's office, she found Captain Morrison waiting in the hallway, his right arm heavily bandaged and supported by a sling. Morrison's face was pale, his eyes hollowed by pain medication, but his expression carried defiance rather than remorse. When he saw Elena, he attempted to straighten to attention, but winced at the movement. "Commander Reeves," Morrison said, his voice slurred slightly by medication. "I need to speak with you." Elena considered walking past him, but curiosity stopped her. "Captain Morrison, you're under arrest for assault. I don't think we should be having private conversations." "I'm not under arrest," Morrison corrected. "My attorney convinced the Master-at-Arms to delay formal charges pending the administrative review, and I'm not here to threaten you or continue our earlier disagreement." "Then why are you here?" Morrison glanced around the corridor, ensuring they were alone. "To tell you that you're in more danger than you realize. Marcus Garrett didn't act alone. He had partners, people much higher up the chain of command, who benefited from the equipment diversions and who have a lot to lose if this investigation expands." "If you're suggesting I should back off to protect myself, Captain, I'm not interested." "I'm not suggesting you back off," Morrison said. "I'm warning you that these people will do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Lieutenant Shaw's brake failure? That wasn't an accident. Commander Peterson's alcohol problem? It was created through drugged drinks at official functions. Captain Brennan's planted documents? Vice Admiral Peterson arranged that personally." Elena felt her blood run cold. "How do you know this?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Because I was there. I helped with some of it. Not the criminal stuff. I was never involved in the equipment diversions. But I helped suppress investigations, discredit witnesses, make problems disappear. I told myself I was protecting the Navy's reputation, that I was maintaining good order and discipline." He looked down at his shattered arm. "But when you exposed Garrett's corruption, when you showed that the system could work if people had courage, I realized that I'd been protecting criminals rather than the institution. And when I poured that coffee on you today, I was trying to silence someone telling the truth, because the truth was inconvenient for people I considered friends." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're going to need allies," Morrison said. "Wellington is planning to destroy your credibility by suggesting you have a pattern of violence and instability. He's going to bring up every tough call you made as a SEAL team leader, every enemy combatant you killed, every decision that could be second-guessed with hindsight. He's going to try to make you look like a dangerous person who shouldn't be trusted with a badge." "I made decisions in combat that I stand behind," Elena said firmly. "I believe you, but Wellington is very good at taking complex situations and reducing them to sound bites that make good officers look bad. And he's got resources and connections that will make your life hell for as long as this investigation continues." Morrison shifted his weight, wincing at the pain in his arm. "I'm going to cooperate fully with NCIS. I'm going to testify about everything I know regarding Peterson's involvement and the retaliation against officers who questioned Garrett. My career is over either way, but maybe I can do one decent thing before it ends." Elena studied Morrison's face, looking for deception or manipulation, but all she saw was a broken man who had finally accepted responsibility for his actions. "Captain," Elena said quietly, "what you did today was assault. Your offer to cooperate doesn't erase that, and I'm not going to ask the prosecutors to go easy on you." "I understand. I'm not asking for leniency. I'm just trying to do the right thing for once." Morrison turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Commander, I'm sorry. Not just for the coffee, though I'm definitely sorry for that, but for all of it. For helping create a culture where corruption could flourish. For attacking you when you exposed it. For being too cowardly to do what you did." He walked away slowly, favoring his injured arm. Elena watched him go, feeling a complex mixture of anger at his assault and grudging respect for his willingness to accept responsibility. The situation was even more complicated than she had realized. If Vice Admiral Peterson was involved, the corruption extended to the highest levels of naval leadership. The administrative review wasn't just about her conduct. It was about whether the Navy would genuinely address systemic corruption or whether powerful people would successfully protect their own. Elena pulled out her phone and called Agent Walsh. "We need to talk," Elena said when Walsh answered. "Captain Morrison just provided information about Vice Admiral Peterson's involvement in the corruption and retaliation. He's willing to cooperate fully." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Where are you right now, Commander?" "Outside Admiral Hawthorne's office." "Stay there, I'm coming back immediately." 3 weeks of administrative leave passed in a blur of depositions, interviews, and testimony. Elena spent her days in NCIS offices, methodically documenting every aspect of her investigation and her encounters with Garrett and Morrison. She spent her evenings in her quarters, reading legal briefs and preparing for the administrative review that would determine her career's future. But the isolation she had expected never materialized. Instead, she found herself supported by a network of personnel who refused to let her face this alone. Master Chief Hayes organized a rotation of sailors who would stop by Elena's quarters each evening with updates from the base, messages of support from personnel who couldn't visit directly, and reports on how the reforms were being implemented. The visits were brief and professional, but they carried an unmistakable message. Elena hadn't been abandoned. Lieutenant Foster, her former office mate, compiled comprehensive documentation of every equipment discrepancy he had observed over the past 8 years, creating an evidence trail that corroborated Elena's findings and demonstrated that the corruption had been ongoing long before her arrival. His testimony was particularly valuable because it came from someone who had no connection to Elena before her arrival and no obvious motive to lie. Even Commander Jacobson, who had been cautious about Elena's investigation initially, publicly defended the reforms and created new reporting mechanisms that made it easier for personnel to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. The administrative review was held in a conference room at NCIS headquarters. Elena sat at a table with Agent Walsh, while a 3-person board, 2 captains and a rear admiral, reviewed the evidence and heard testimony from dozens of witnesses. Wellington, representing both Garrett and Morrison, did exactly what Morrison had predicted. He portrayed Elena as an aggressive officer with a history of violence, someone who used her SEAL training to intimidate and harm fellow service members. He brought up combat decisions she had made during deployments, suggesting they demonstrated poor judgment and excessive force. But for every accusation Wellington made, Agent Walsh had evidence to refute it. Combat action reports that praised Elena's tactical decisions, testimony from SEAL team members who served under her command and who described her as level-headed and professional. Video footage from the officers' lounge that clearly showed Morrison assaulting Elena first and her response being measured and defensive. The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Vice Admiral Peterson's executive officer, Commander Sarah Mitchell, appeared before the board with immunity from prosecution and testified that Peterson had been receiving kickbacks from the shell companies buying Garrett's diverted equipment. Mitchell provided bank records, emails, and recorded phone conversations that demolished any pretense that Peterson was innocent. Peterson was arrested 2 hours after Mitchell's testimony concluded. The head of Naval Personnel Management, one of the most powerful admirals in the service, led away in handcuffs by NCIS agents while television cameras captured every moment. The scandal exploded across military and civilian media. Stories about corruption at the highest levels of naval leadership dominated news cycles for days. Congress announced hearings. The Secretary of the Navy promised comprehensive reforms, and Elena found herself at the center of a story that had grown far beyond a simple investigation of equipment diversion. On the 18th day after the review began, the three-person board delivered their findings. Commander Elena Reeves, Rear Admiral Thompson said, reading from prepared remarks, "This board has reviewed all evidence related to your investigation of corruption at Naval Station Pacific Harbor and your defensive actions when assaulted by Captain Richard Morrison. Our findings are as follows." Elena held her breath, waiting for the verdict that would define her career. Regarding the investigation, Commander Reeves operated under proper authorization from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Her methods were professional, thorough, and legally sound. The evidence she collected has led to successful prosecutions of multiple officers and has exposed systemic corruption that threatened military readiness. This board commends Commander Reeves for her courage, integrity, and dedication to justice. Elena felt relief wash over her, but Thompson wasn't finished. Regarding the assault by Captain Morrison, Commander Reeves was the victim of an unprovoked attack involving both physical restraint and the use of hot liquid as a weapon. Her defensive response was appropriate, measured, and consistent with her training. The injury sustained by Captain Morrison was a direct result of his decision to assault a fellow officer, not the result of excessive force by Commander Reeves. Thompson looked up from his remarks, meeting Elena's eyes. "Commander, the Navy owes you an apology. You were placed on administrative leave, not because your conduct warranted investigation, but because powerful people wanted to protect corrupt colleagues. That was wrong, and it represented exactly the kind of institutional failure that allowed corruption to flourish in the first place." He paused, then continued with obvious emotion. "The reforms that have been implemented at Pacific Harbor and throughout the Navy as a result of your investigation will save lives, protect equipment, and restore trust in our institution. You exemplify the best traditions of naval service, and it is this board's honor to clear you of any wrongdoing." The relief Elena felt was overwhelming. She had known intellectually that the evidence supported her, but 3 weeks of uncertainty had taken their toll. To hear it officially confirmed, to know that her career wasn't destroyed, to understand that the system had actually worked, it was almost too much to process. "Thank you, sir," Elena managed to say. "Commander," Thompson continued, "this board is also recommending that you be awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for your investigation and the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for your undercover work. Additionally, Admiral Hawthorne has requested that you be permanently assigned to Pacific Harbor as the base's first Inspector General, with the authority to investigate any allegations of misconduct or corruption." Elena hadn't expected that. She had assumed her time at Pacific Harbor was over, that she would return to NCIS or be reassigned to some other posting. The offer to stay, to continue the work she had started, to help ensure the reforms actually became permanent, it was both daunting and appealing. "I'm honored by Admiral Hawthorne's confidence," Elena said, "and I accept the assignment." The board concluded shortly after, and Elena found herself surrounded by well-wishers, Agent Walsh, AUSA Chen, Master Chief Hayes, who had traveled to headquarters specifically to hear the verdict, and dozens of others who had supported her throughout the ordeal. But the person Elena most wanted to see was waiting outside the conference room. Admiral Hawthorne stood in the hallway, and when Elena emerged, he snapped to attention and saluted with a precision that spoke of genuine respect rather than routine protocol. "Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said, holding the salute, "on behalf of the United States Navy, thank you for your service, your courage, and your unwavering commitment to justice." It has been my honor to have you at my command." Elena returned the salute, overwhelmed by the formal recognition from an officer she had come to respect deeply. "Thank you, sir, for supporting the investigation, implementing reforms, and fighting to protect me when powerful people wanted me silenced." "I should have done more," Hawthorne said as he lowered his hand. "I should have seen the signs of corruption earlier. I should have created a culture where personnel felt safe reporting problems. I should have questioned Garrett's activities when discrepancies first appeared. Sir, the culture didn't fail because of you. It failed because of systemic problems that extend far beyond any one command. But you're fixing those problems now, and that's what matters." Hawthorne nodded, accepting her assessment. "I want you to know that the reforms we implemented at Pacific Harbor are being adopted fleet-wide. Protected reporting mechanisms, independent inspectors general at every major command, mandatory training on recognizing and reporting corruption. The Navy is changing, Commander, because of what you did." "Because of what a lot of people did," Elena corrected. "Lieutenant Foster, who documented discrepancies for years. Commander Torres, who preserved evidence when it would have been easier to look away. Petty Officer Martinez and the other enlisted personnel who had the courage to speak up. This was never about one person. It was about people deciding that integrity mattered more than convenience." "True," Hawthorne agreed, "but leadership requires someone to take the first step, someone to accept the risk that comes with speaking truth to power. You did that, and everyone else followed your example." Elena returned to Pacific Harbor on a Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks and 2 days after her administrative leave had begun. She had expected a quiet return, perhaps a brief meeting with Admiral Hawthorne before assuming her new duties as Inspector General. What she found instead was a formation. Every officer on the base, all 175 of them, stood in perfect ranks on the parade ground. Behind them, approximately 500 enlisted personnel had gathered, not in formal formation, but in organized groups by department and specialty. As Elena's car approached, Admiral Hawthorne stepped forward. The entire formation snapped to attention. Elena emerged from the vehicle, confused and overwhelmed by the display. Hawthorne saluted, and Elena returned the gesture automatically. "Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying across the parade ground, "the officers and crew of Naval Station Pacific Harbor request the honor of formally welcoming you to your new assignment as our first Inspector General." Before Elena could respond, something extraordinary happened. Starting with the officers in the front rank and spreading like a wave through the formation, every person present began to applaud. Not the polite applause of formal ceremonies, but the thunderous, sustained applause of people celebrating something they genuinely believed in. The sound was overwhelming. Elena stood frozen, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented display of recognition and support. Master Chief Hayes stepped forward from the enlisted ranks. "Commander Reeves, permission to speak, ma'am?" "Granted," Elena replied, her voice tight with emotion. "Ma'am, over the past 3 weeks, every person here has been watching what happened to you. We watched you expose corruption. We watched you defend yourself from assault. We watched you placed on administrative leave while people questioned whether you had done the right thing." Hayes paused, looking at the assembled personnel. "And we watched you get cleared of all wrongdoing. We watched Vice Admiral Peterson get arrested. We watched the system actually work for once because you refused to give up. So we wanted you to know you're not alone. You never were. And every person here is committed to making sure the reforms you fought for actually become permanent." The applause intensified. Elena looked out over the formation, seeing faces she recognized. Foster, Martinez, Chen, Torres, Jacobson, and hundreds she didn't. But every face showed the same expression: respect, gratitude, and determination. "Thank you," Elena said, projecting her voice to carry across the parade ground. "All of you. What happened over the past few weeks wasn't about me. It was about all of us deciding that we deserved better than a system that tolerated corruption and punished integrity. You made that decision every time you documented discrepancies, every time you supported a colleague who raised concerns, every time you refused to accept that wrongdoing by powerful people should be ignored. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I'm honored to serve as your Inspector General, but I need you to understand that this position only works if you use it. If you see misconduct, report it. If you have concerns about corruption, raise them. If you witness retaliation against someone who spoke up, document it and bring it to my attention. The system only works if we all commit to using it properly, and that commitment has to be stronger than our fear, stronger than our desire for convenience, stronger than any relationship or loyalty that asks us to look away from wrongdoing. Admiral Hawthorne stepped forward again. Commander Reeves, there's one more thing. He gestured to Captain Chambers, who approached carrying a wooden case. Chambers opened the case to reveal two medals, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal and the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, exactly as the review board had recommended. Commander Elena Reeves, Hawthorne said formally, for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service as an undercover investigator for the Naval Criminal Investigative Service from July to October. Commander Reeves conducted a comprehensive investigation into systematic corruption, personally gathering evidence that led to successful prosecution of multiple officers and exposed systemic failures in oversight and accountability. Her courage, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice exemplify the highest traditions of naval service. Hawthorne pinned the first medal to Elena's uniform, then continued with the second citation. As he worked, Elena noticed something remarkable happening in the formation. Officers were openly crying, both men and women, junior and senior, people from every specialty and background. They weren't crying because of the medals or the ceremony. They were crying because they were witnessing something that many had believed impossible. An officer who exposed corruption being honored rather than punished. A woman who defended herself from assault being celebrated rather than blamed. A junior person who challenged senior leaders being promoted rather than transferred. It was proof that the system could work. And for people who had dedicated their lives to serving that system, who had endured its failures and disappointments, who had watched good people destroyed by protecting corrupt colleagues, seeing the system actually work was profoundly emotional. When Hawthorne finished pinning the medals, he stepped back and saluted. The entire formation followed instantly, creating a wave of salutes that seemed to stretch forever. Elena returned the gesture, holding her salute as she had been taught at the Naval Academy 20 years ago. But this salute meant something different than all the thousands she had given before. This wasn't routine protocol or empty ceremony. This was respect. Real, earned, genuine respect from people who had watched her sacrifice and suffer and refused to quit. Respect from people who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. Respect from people who knew that integrity sometimes required standing alone against powerful forces that wanted you to fail. As Elena lowered her hand, she realized that the past 3 weeks, the investigation, the assault, the administrative review, all of it had been worth the cost. Because the system had worked. Justice had been served. And the culture that had allowed corruption to flourish for years was finally beginning to change. 6 months after Elena Reeves assumed her duties as Inspector General of Naval Station Pacific Harbor, the transformation of the base was undeniable. The reforms that Admiral Hawthorne had announced in the immediate aftermath of Garrett's arrest had been implemented with unexpected thoroughness. Protected reporting mechanisms allowed personnel to raise concerns anonymously without fear of retaliation. Independent oversight committees reviewed all major equipment transactions and financial decisions. Mandatory training on recognizing and reporting corruption had become part of every sailor's professional development. But more than the formal policies, the culture itself had shifted. Personnel felt empowered to question decisions that didn't make sense, to challenge superiors when they witnessed misconduct, to speak up rather than staying silent. The change wasn't universal. Institutional cultures evolved slowly, and there were still pockets of resistance. But the trajectory was clear. Elena spent her days conducting investigations, reviewing complaints, and working with department heads to identify systemic vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. It was demanding work that required diplomatic skills she hadn't fully developed during her SEAL career, but she found it deeply satisfying. The most rewarding aspect wasn't the formal investigations, but the informal conversations. Junior officers would stop by her office to discuss concerns they weren't sure constituted misconduct, but wanted to run past someone. Enlisted personnel would request guidance on whether something they witnessed warranted a formal report. Department heads would seek her input on policy decisions to ensure they weren't inadvertently creating opportunities for corruption. These conversations represented something profound. Personnel actually trusted the system to work properly. After years of seeing problems ignored or whistleblowers punished, they were beginning to believe that integrity mattered more than political convenience. Elena was reviewing a supply chain audit one Tuesday morning when Master Chief Hayes appeared at her door. "Commander, there's someone here to see you," Hayes said. "She says it's important." "Who is it?" "Lieutenant Rebecca Torres. She served here 5 years ago and filed a harassment complaint against Commander Garrett that was quietly buried." Elena felt a chill. Rebecca Torres was one of the officers whose career had been damaged by retaliation after she questioned Garrett's activities. The official record showed she had requested a transfer to pursue other opportunities, but the reality was that she had been driven out. "Send her in," Elena said. Rebecca Torres entered tentatively, her body language suggesting someone who had learned to be wary of military offices. She was 32 years old, with the careful posture of someone who had been hurt and didn't want to be hurt again. "Lieutenant Torres," Elena said, standing to shake her hand. "I'm Commander Reeves. Please, sit down." Torres sat on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you for seeing me, Commander. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I've been following the news about what happened here, and I felt like I needed to say something." "Take your time," Elena said gently. Torres took a shaky breath. 5 years ago, I was a junior officer assigned to logistics at this base. I noticed discrepancies in equipment records, the same kinds of things you eventually documented. When I raised concerns about them, Commander Garrett told me I was mistaken and that I needed to stop making accusations against senior personnel. "But you didn't stop," Elena prompted. "No, I filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General's office at the regional command. I documented everything I could find: missing equipment, falsified receiving reports, suspicious shell companies receiving Navy contracts." Torres's voice wavered. "A week after I filed that complaint, classified documents appeared in my quarters. Documents I had never seen before, that I had no authorization to possess. I was arrested, investigated, and eventually cleared when they realized the documents had been planted." "But by then your career was damaged," Elena said quietly. "By then my career was destroyed. I was labeled as someone with poor judgment, someone who couldn't be trusted with sensitive information. I requested a transfer because staying here was unbearable. Everyone knew what had happened, and most people believed I was guilty despite being cleared." Torres looked directly at Elena, her eyes bright with tears. "For 5 years, I've been telling myself that speaking up was a mistake, that I should have kept my mouth shut, played the game, accepted that corruption was just how things worked. I blamed myself for being naive, for thinking the system would protect someone telling the truth." "But you weren't wrong to speak up," Elena said firmly. "You were right, and the system failed you." "That's what I came here to say," Torres replied, wiping at her eyes. watching what happened to you, how you investigated corruption, how you were attacked, how you were placed on administrative leave. I was terrified that history was repeating itself. I thought they were going to do to you what they did to me." And she paused, gathering her composure. "But they didn't. You were cleared. Vice Admiral Peterson was arrested. The officers who retaliated against people like me are facing consequences. And when I saw you being honored on that parade ground, when I saw hundreds of people supporting you, I realized that the system actually worked. It worked because people like you documented what you witnessed," Elena said. "Your complaint 5 years ago created a paper trail that corroborated my investigation. The fact that you were retaliated against demonstrated a pattern of misconduct that helped prosecutors build their case. You didn't fail, Lieutenant. The institution failed you." Torres nodded slowly. "I wanted you to know that what you did mattered, not just for catching the people who were corrupt, but for proving that speaking up doesn't have to mean career suicide. You gave people like me hope that the system could actually work if someone had the courage to use it properly." "Thank you for coming here," Elena said. "And Lieutenant, if you're interested, I'd like to review your service record and see if there's any possibility of reversing the damage to your career. What was done to you was retaliation, and you deserve to have that acknowledged officially." Torres looked shocked. "You would do that? It's literally my job as Inspector General to identify and remedy injustices, and what happened to you was definitely an injustice." Over the next several weeks, Elena worked with NCIS and the Navy's Personnel Command to review the cases of all officers who had been retaliated against for questioning Garrett's activities or reporting corruption. Lieutenant Rebecca Torres was formally cleared of all implications of wrongdoing. Her service record was corrected to remove the negative marks, and she was offered the opportunity to return to active duty if she chose. Not all the cases had such positive outcomes. Some officers had left the Navy entirely and didn't want to return. Others had moved on to civilian careers and were satisfied with their choices. But every single one received formal apologies from the Navy and official acknowledgement that they had been wrongfully targeted for retaliation. The process took months, but Elena found it deeply satisfying. These were the hidden victims of corruption, people who had tried to do the right thing and been punished for it, whose stories had been buried or forgotten, who had carried the weight of failure when the institution had failed them. 1 year after Elena's investigation concluded, Admiral Hawthorne gathered the senior staff to review the results of the reforms. "In the past 12 months, Hawthorne reported, we've seen a 73% increase in reported concerns about misconduct or policy violations. That might sound like a negative development, but it actually indicates that personnel trust the reporting system to work properly." He pulled up statistics on the main screen. Of those reports, 82% were resolved at the unit level through clarification or minor policy adjustments. 15% required formal investigation, resulting in disciplinary action against personnel who violated regulations. 3% were determined to be unfounded after investigation. "What's most significant," Hawthorne continued, "is that not a single person who filed a report has faced retaliation. Our protected reporting mechanisms are working exactly as designed. Personnel can raise concerns without fear of punishment." Captain Chambers spoke up. "Admiral, how does our performance compare to other commands?" "Pacific Harbor has become the model for accountability reform throughout the Navy," Hawthorne replied. "Other bases are implementing our procedures, our training programs, and our oversight mechanisms. The Secretary of the Navy recently cited us as an example of how institutional culture can change when leadership commits to genuine reform." Elena felt a quiet pride at Hawthorne's words. The investigation that had nearly cost her career had become a catalyst for fleet-wide change. "Commander Reeves," Hawthorne said, turning to address her directly, "your position as Inspector General has been so successful that NavOps is recommending we establish similar positions at every major command. They're asking if you would be willing to train the officers who will fill those roles. It was an honor, but also a recognition that the work Elena had started needed to expand beyond Pacific Harbor. I'd be happy to help with that training, sir, though I hope whoever takes these positions understands that the job isn't about catching people doing wrong. It's about creating a culture where doing right is the easiest choice. That's exactly the philosophy we need, Hawthorne agreed. The meeting concluded shortly after, but Elena found herself thinking about how far the base had come. 1 year ago, corruption had been an open secret that everyone knew about, but no one addressed. Personnel who questioned misconduct were silenced or transferred. Power protected the powerful, and junior personnel learned to keep their heads down and accept that this was simply how things worked. Now, the culture was fundamentally different, not perfect. Institutional change took years, not months, but measurably better. People spoke up, leaders listened, problems were addressed rather than buried, and the system actually worked more often than it failed. That evening, Elena was walking across the parade ground when she encountered a formation of new recruits completing their initial training. They stood at attention as their instructor, a grizzled master chief with 30 years of service, addressed them about the Navy's values. Honor, courage, commitment, the master chief said, his voice carrying across the parade ground. Those aren't just words on a poster, they're the foundation of everything we do. And when you see someone violating those values, you have a responsibility to speak up. He paused, then gestured toward Elena. That's Commander Reeves, our Inspector General. A year ago, she exposed corruption that had been poisoning this command for years. She was dismissed, condescended to, and eventually assaulted, but she refused to quit. She documented the evidence, she built her case, and she proved that the system could work if people had the courage to use it properly. The recruits turned to look at Elena, their young faces showing curiosity and respect. I want every one of you to remember something, the Master Chief continued. Someday in your career, you're going to see something wrong, something that violates regulations, something that betrays the trust placed in us by the American people. And in that moment, you're going to have a choice. Stay silent and be complicit, or speak up and risk consequences. He locked eyes with each recruit in turn. When that moment comes, I want you to remember Commander Reeves. Remember that doing the right thing is hard. Remember that speaking truth to power requires courage. But remember that the system can work if we're brave enough to use it. Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She had never sought to be a symbol or an example. She had simply done what needed to be done, following the evidence where it led, refusing to accept that corruption should be tolerated. But if her story could inspire other personnel to speak up, if it could give courage to people facing their own moments of decision, if it could demonstrate that integrity sometimes prevailed over political expediency, then all of it had been worthwhile. As Elena continued her walk, she passed the senior officers' lounge where Captain Morrison had assaulted her 1 year ago. The lounge had been renovated since then, with new furniture and fresh paint that removed any trace of that violent confrontation. But Elena didn't need physical reminders. The memory was seared into her consciousness. The smell of burning coffee, the sharp pain as hot liquid soaked through her uniform, the instant calculation of threat and response, the wet crack of Morrison's elbow breaking under controlled force. She had acted in self-defense. The evidence had confirmed that. The review board had cleared her of any wrongdoing, but Elena still wondered sometimes if she could have responded differently, if there was a way to neutralize the threat without causing such severe injury. Commander Torres, walking past on his way to a meeting, seemed to read her thoughts. Still thinking about Morrison? He asked quietly. Sometimes, Elena admitted, he made a choice to assault you. You made a choice to defend yourself. The fact that his choice resulted in consequences isn't your burden to carry. I know, intellectually, I know that. But it's harder emotionally. Torres nodded. That's because you have a conscience. People who break bones without regret are the ones you need to worry about. He paused, then added, For what it's worth, Morrison is doing okay. His elbow healed. He took a plea deal that kept him out of prison. And last I heard, he was working as a consultant helping other organizations identify and prevent corruption. His experience taught him something, even if it took a broken arm to do it. Elena was surprised to hear that. She had expected Morrison to remain bitter and resentful, blaming her for destroying his career. The fact that he had chosen redemption over revenge suggested that people could change if given the opportunity. What about Garrett? Elena asked. Prison. 15 years for fraud, equipment diversion, and conspiracy. He'll be eligible for parole in 10 years if he maintains good behavior. Torres's expression hardened. Vice Admiral Peterson got 20 years. The court threw the book at him because of his rank and the scope of his betrayal. Justice served. Not perfectly. The system never worked perfectly, but substantially. The corrupt officers were in prison. The stolen equipment had been recovered or reimbursed. The reforms were in place to prevent similar corruption in the future. And the personnel who had been wrongfully targeted for retaliation had received apologies and restitution. It was more than Elena had dared hope for when she first arrived at Pacific Harbor 14 months ago. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where are you watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget. Epilogue. 3 years later, Commander Elena Reeves stood at the podium of the Naval War College, addressing a room full of senior officers attending the new Accountability and Institutional Integrity course that had been established in the wake of the Pacific Harbor investigation. Corruption flourishes in silence, Elena told the assembled officers. It thrives when good people convince themselves that speaking up is someone else's responsibility. It survives when institutions prioritize reputation over justice, when leaders protect their friends rather than the mission, when fear of consequences outweighs commitment to integrity. She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics on corruption cases that had been exposed and resolved over the past 3 years. Since implementing the Pacific Harbor reforms fleet-wide, we've seen a 300% increase in reported concerns about misconduct. But we've also seen a 200% decrease in sustained cases of corruption. Why? Because when people know the system works, they report problems early, before they metastasize into serious crimes. An older captain raised his hand. Commander, doesn't that create a culture of suspicion where personnel are constantly reporting each other for minor infractions? That's a valid concern, Elena acknowledged, and we address it through training that helps people distinguish between honest mistakes and deliberate misconduct. The goal isn't to punish every error, it's to identify patterns of behavior that indicate systemic problems. A single inventory discrepancy might be a clerical error. 17 inventory discrepancies over 3 years with the same officer involved? That's a pattern worth investigating. She advanced to the next slide. The other critical element is what happens after someone reports a concern. If they're thanked for bringing it to attention, if the issue is resolved transparently, if they face no retaliation for speaking up, they learn that the system works. But if they're dismissed, threatened, or punished, they learn to stay silent. Elena spent the next 2 hours discussing case studies, walking through investigations both successful and challenging, and answering questions about how to balance operational efficiency with accountability. When the session concluded, a young lieutenant commander approached her. Commander Reeves, I have a question that's more personal than professional, if that's okay? Of course. I'm in a situation similar to what you faced at Pacific Harbor. I've identified what I believe is systematic fraud in contract procurement, but the officers involved are senior to me and well-connected. I've documented everything I can, but I'm terrified that reporting it will destroy my career." The young officer's voice shook slightly. "How do I find the courage to move forward?" Elena studied the lieutenant commander's face, seeing her own fears reflected there. "I can't tell you it will be easy, because it won't be. I can't promise there won't be consequences, because there probably will be. What I can tell you is that you've already found the courage. You're here asking the question, which means you've already decided to act. But what if they retaliate? What if your career is damaged? What if speaking up costs you everything you've worked for?" Elena completed the thought. "Those are all real possibilities, but here's the question you need to ask yourself. Can you live with staying silent? Can you accept being complicit in fraud because speaking up was risky? Can you look at yourself in the mirror knowing that you chose convenience over integrity?" The lieutenant commander was quiet for a long moment. "No, I can't." "Then you already know what you need to do. Document everything. Work with NCIS or your Inspector General to ensure your report is properly protected. And understand that you're not alone. There's an entire network of people who will support you if you take this step." "Thank you, Commander. That helps." As the young officer walked away, Elena felt a familiar mixture of pride and concern. Pride that personnel were still finding courage to challenge corruption, concern about the personal costs they would inevitably face. But this was the reality of institutional change. It wasn't accomplished through single dramatic actions, but through thousands of smaller decisions by individuals who chose integrity over convenience, who spoke up rather than staying silent, who believed that the system could work if people made it work. Elena gathered her materials and prepared to leave the War College. Her next assignment was waiting, a congressional testimony about military accountability reforms, followed by a meeting with the Secretary of the Navy about expanding Inspector General positions throughout the armed forces. The work never ended. For every corrupt officer exposed, another saw an opportunity. For every whistleblower protected, another faced retaliation. For every reform successfully implemented, resistance emerged from people invested in the old system. But the trajectory was positive. 3 years after Elena had arrived at Pacific Harbor as an undercover investigator, the Navy was measurably more accountable, more transparent, and more committed to integrity than it had been. Not perfect. Institutions composed of humans could never be perfect, but better. And better was worth fighting for. As Elena left the War College and walked toward her car, she noticed her reflection in the building's glass windows. She wore the rank insignia of a captain now, promoted ahead of her peers in recognition of her service. Her ribbon rack included decorations for valor, for investigation, for leadership. Her reputation had evolved from that of a disruptive outsider to that of a reform leader whose methods were studied and emulated. But when Elena looked at her reflection, she didn't see the medals or the rank. She saw the woman who had spent 3 weeks accepting condescension while building a case against corruption. She saw the SEAL who had refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. She saw the officer who had been poured hot coffee on and who had defended herself without apology or regret. She saw someone who had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. That integrity sometimes required standing alone against powerful forces. That justice was possible if people were brave enough to demand it. And she saw someone who would do it all again if necessary. Because some things were worth fighting for. The institution she served, despite its flaws, was one of them. The people who served alongside her, who trusted that the system could work, were worth protecting. The ideals of honor, courage, and commitment, worn though they might be, compromised though they sometimes were, remained worth defending. Elena climbed into her car and headed toward Washington, D.C., where her congressional testimony would shape the next generation of military accountability reforms. She was tired. 3 years of fighting institutional resistance had taken their toll, but she was also determined. The work continued. It would always continue. But as long as people like Elena Reeves existed, people who refused to accept that corruption was inevitable, who chose integrity over convenience, who believed that the system could work if people made it work, there was hope. And hope, Elena had learned, was more powerful than fear. 3 years after a lieutenant commander had poured hot coffee down her uniform, after she had shattered a captain's elbow in self-defense, after she had been placed on administrative leave while powerful people tried to discredit her, Elena Reeves was still fighting. Not with fists or weapons anymore, but with testimony and training, with policies and reforms, with example and inspiration. The battles had changed, but the mission remained the same: justice, accountability, and integrity, no matter the cost. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from, and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget?